But I had no idea I was going to get it.
Yeah, it's today's defendant.
No idea.
This is tomorrow's victim, and deal with these people over and over.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
We got our technology all set. We do have all our commission members here in New York, so welcome and thank you. I appreciate everyone taking the time out of their schedules to be here, and for those who travel, thank you for traveling to be here. Our first item on our agenda is the review and approval of our meeting agenda. The agenda was sent out with the meeting materials. Is there any discussion regarding the agenda? And if not, do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
All right, do I have a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, so that passes. Next item on our agenda is review and approval of the draft minutes from our March 13th, 2019 meeting. Again, those minutes were distributed with the meeting materials. Are there any questions or comments with regard to the minutes? And if not, do I have a motion to approve those minutes? Move. Do I have a second? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone
Abstain.
Okay. 2 abstentions. Anyone opposed? All right, great. Thank you. Passes. Next, we have our accreditations and laboratory updates. The first item we have on the agenda relates to the Nassau County Division of Forensic Services. There is a vote required. There is a binding recommendation for reaccreditation that's contained in a letter that's in the materials dated May 20th of this year. There's also a letter dated April 17th of this year regarding renewal of accreditation. Attached documentation with that letter. It's my understanding in October the lab underwent their ANAB reaccreditation assessment. The lab, as I read the documentation, successfully remediated many of the findings. There was an issue that we've discussed previously that went back to the DNA subcommittee, but as I understand it, that issue was also resolved by the lab performing a supplemental validation and updating its mixture interpretation SOPs. So are there any questions or any discussion regarding this item? We do have Pat here with us, obviously.
Super quick. I think
Take as much time as you need.
Anticipated that the revalidation would affirm the protocols. I just want to know whether there's any change in the protocols from the revalidation.
None. Actually, the final statements confirm the original validations. But one thing that I do want to point out is that the feds basically overturned it, but unfortunately we had to provide the additional addendum for ANAB. The only thing that did change was the clarification of the term clear major. That was about it in the manual.
How did it change?
Essentially, clear major, rather than just saying clear major was explained as the ability to interpret without the use of just permutation, mathematics, no calculator. Not stated that way exactly, but paraphrasing.
Any other questions? All right, thank you. Do I have a motion to reaccredit the Nassau County Office of the Medical Examiner, Division of Forensic Sciences in the field of forensic testing for a period concurrent with its ANAB accreditation? Scott, do I have a second?
Second.
Dan? Right, all in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? And any abstentions? Pat? Did you abstain? Yeah. Right. So that carries. Congratulations, Pat.
Thank you.
Next, we have the Nassau County Medical Examiner Toxicology Laboratory. There's a vote required here as well. It's my understanding from the materials that in April, the lab underwent an ABFT reaccreditation inspection. There were no non-conformances. There were 14 suggestions for improvement. The ABFT doesn't require these suggestions to be addressed. However, we do have information from the lab that responds to the suggestions. As I read them, it looked like a lot of the suggestions reflect reflected things that might pertain to a transition to an ANAB accreditation. So, personally, I was glad to see them in there and see that the lab had addressed them. So any questions with regard to the reaccreditation for the Nassau County Medical Examiner Toxicology Lab? If there's no questions, do I have a motion to reaccredit the Nassau County Office of the Medical Examiner Toxicology Laboratory in the discipline of forensic toxicology for a period concurrent with its ABFT accreditation? The motion, do I have a second? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, any abstentions?
Is the lab director here?
Yes.
Just a question, how is the transition to the ANAB
Maybe if we can, if you just come up to
now
the
or
table.
later?
I think it's a good question.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So the question is, how is the transition going?
Yeah, how's it going?
Yeah, so naturally, obviously, going through this most recent inspection, that devotes a certain amount of energy from the laboratory. But following that, and especially following completion here today, we are transitioning well. I mean, we've had an eye on the 17025 standards, and as the commissioner rightly said, many of the things that came up or were under consideration by the inspection team did relate to those things that we were transitioning to. So, as an example, the SOP system, the Qualtrac system that we have begun to use actively goes a long way to satisfying many of the criteria for 17025. In part, for instance, some of our personnel records, they wanted to see more of them in the Qualtrac system. We are actively putting them into the system. Some of those records we probably wouldn't, so there was some disagreement there on, what should be there and what not. But it really was more of a reflection of a transition that wasn't complete. So, I mean, we feel like we're on the right track. Naturally, there have been some other issues that have come up recently, but at this point, we feel like we've had the support. We feel like we are trained, and we've been making decisions with 17025 in mind so that we're compliant with both standards.
Can you comment on what you see as any benefit to the lab, having made all these efforts and making this transition?
Well, I would say like any, criteria, there's certainly are benefits to both standards. So I would say that let me give you a little background, of course. So our laboratory was an ASCLD laboratory for a period of time. There were some aspects of the ASCLD inspection that we retained even as we were an ABFT laboratory because we felt that they were positive, attributes. So there are certainly some positive attributes to 17025. I can frankly say there are some things that I could drop as a 17025 laboratory that are not required by that protocol or that accreditation criteria. So there certainly are some strengths to the ABFT system, but in that instance, of course, we would probably. If we did not retain ABFT accreditation, we would probably retain those things that we felt were, fundamental to doing good science. So it's not like we would drop those entirely. It just may not be something that the inspectors would look at. So,
Have you have any estimate as to what this transition might have cost the lab?
I don't know. I can tell you that we've tried to and probably didn't get very far on it. We'd like to look at some of the costs associated. So, for example, 17025 requires a different level of, because they require people that come in to recalibrate, for example. Those cannot be done by just any vendor. They need to be done by an ISO accredited vendor. Much more expensive. All of the laboratory glassware that we have. It's probably some good old school laboratory glassware that was made and is right on the money. However, we have to change it all out because we don't have the piece of paper that says it's been certified. So we're probably going to spend quite a bit of money getting rid of a lot of glassware that I'd rather keep.
Give it to a high schooler.
Yeah, if it was that easy. That's not even an easy task. You know, I can't give you a number. I can tell you it's definitely, there's a cost factor in terms of materials. There's clearly a cost factor in terms of time and effort. You know, as I said, we would probably have liked to have done some type of an accounting, and we will do some type of an accounting. We just haven't really been. I don't know how much the glassware, for example, is going to cost us at this point. We've made some steps toward that, but then dropped it for the, you know, to get ready for the inspection, and we figure we'll pick that back up again. So.
You're also a DOH, a certified lab, are you not?
No, we're not certified by
separated.
Correct. We participate in some DOH proficiencies. Yeah.
And you have a clinical lab permit, or is that
We
a
do
separate,
not. No, you're probably thinking of Suffolk County, who does clinical laboratory testing.
separate part of the, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But I think it's an issue we should probably make note of the benefit. Yeah, there's some, and significant effort and expense.
I don't disagree. I guess I'm just curious as to, to what end. We didn't really make a choice. ABF2 is going away, so.
Well, no,
It's not
I
that
know,
we pull
but
the rug out from under anybody.
no, but
Yeah. No,
we should be aware of the
I think your
public
question
costs.
certainly, yeah. But, the alternative, since ABFT doesn't exist, there's ANAB, and we looked at any other alternatives, and I think decided as a commission that they weren't viable. And I think at the suggestion of the lab directors, pretty strong suggestion, we thought there was a lot of benefit in having one accreditation and not having a situation where we're in flux and we're back
I'm
and
not
forth.
saying we had an alternative, I'm just,
Okay.
So, well,
Thank you.
in that regard, if you don't mind if I add, I mean, the only thing I would say about that is that the transition is a rapid one. So when the transition was, when ASCLD went from the legacy program to an ISO-based program, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, was over a 5-year period. So there was an allowance. Now, DCGS, I think, has been trying to do everything they can to be supportive. And, as many of these things do, it comes down to money. But we don't have 5 years of money. We have probably about 2 years. So, again, I know that DCGS has been trying to support us that way. And there are material costs associated with this. So we just appreciate those efforts and any other efforts that they can continue to do. So.
All right. First of all, thank you. We have been doing everything that we can within our power to try and support the toxicology labs in the transition, and I certainly appreciate it. As I indicated, I think the areas they pointed out, just reflected the fact that you are working very hard on the transition, and we certainly appreciate that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Forensic Toxicology. And again, there is a vote required here. The laboratory underwent ABSP reaccreditation inspection. As I read the materials, there were 2 nonconformances and 9 suggestions for improvement. One nonconformance, as I read it, pertained to implementation of procedures that were in draft form and hadn't been officially added to the SOP manual. The second finding related to the laboratory not checking the accuracy of the balance at the time of weighing. As I understand it, the lab addressed both of those issues to ABFT satisfaction, and they issued a reaccreditation of the lab for the period of July 1st of this year through June 30th of 2021. And again, it appeared to me on my reading that the suggestions seem to, again, relate to items pertaining to this transition to the ANAB and the 17025 standard. So I think we have Gail Cooper here, do we?
She was unable to make it, so we do have to call her.
Okay, so does anyone have any questions or want us to get Gail on the phone? All right, if there are no questions, do I have a motion to renew the New York State accreditation to the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Forensic Toxicology, in the discipline of forensic toxicology for a period concurrent with their ABFT accreditation?
Motion.
All right, do I have a second?
Second.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? And any abstentions? David? Thank you. We'll just interrupt for a minute to note that Richard White, the Governor's Deputy Secretary for Public Safety, has joined us. Richard, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you.
Next, we have the Onondaga County Medical Examiner Forensic Toxicology Laboratory. And again, there is a vote required here. My review indicates that in April, the lab underwent an ABFT reaccreditation inspection. There was one nonconformance, 8 suggestions for improvement. As I read it, the nonconformance related to a calibration issue. Laboratory has validated a more robust multiple point validation. It appears to me that it was addressed to the satisfaction of ABFT. They reaccredited the laboratory for a period from July 1st of this year through June 30th of 2021. And again, as I read it, it appeared that these suggestions, again, related to that transition we've discussed. So I do think we have a representative from the lab. Is it Christy Barba here with us? Right, so if anyone has any questions.
I just have a question. I just
Maybe
wonder.
we can, just before you start.
Okay.
If you could come up, thank you. And thank you for being here today.
Hi, Christy. I just have a question. Could you just explain that 40-50% issue that they didn't like, and just explain it to someone that's not a scientist? So I just am comfortable with what you. I read everything. I read your response.
Yeah.
I just so I can wrap my head around it in non-scientific terms.
Okay, so what your standard you're talking about is tracking internal standard recovery. We add internal standard to use for quantitation. And the reason why it's a suggested 50%, it's making sure someone's not adding half the amount by accident. And when we started, this was before the standard was put forth, we started with 40%. It's very similar, close to 50, and since we had historical data that showed as long as we're tracking at 40, we're okay. That we didn't, when the standard came out, we didn't change it to 50 because it was a suggestion.
Oh.
But we're going to still look into it just to triple check. But, I mean, our historical data shows that we're okay.
So 40 was acceptable, and then this new standard came out.
Yeah, there was no standard when we started doing it.
Okay. That helps explain. Thank you.
I have just one quick question. The term inconclusive, what's your opinion? Does it need to be changed, or is the term inconclusive used? Do you want? I'm sure you're aware,
Yeah.
but do you want me to read it, or?
No.
Okay.
So, in my opinion, it's acceptable to use inconclusive. If you can't call something positive and you can't call something negative, it's inconclusive.
What term were they looking for?
I don't know.
Or for a suggestion? Which I know they're
Their
not supposed to,
suggestion was, if you can't determine, it's not there. And I'm like, but that's not negative. In my mind, if it's not negative and it's not positive, it's inconclusive. Their concern was that it may be confusing to our end user. And it's been discussed, we've talked about it with our previous chief medical examiner, and he actually, there's 2 options in our standardized reporting. He didn't like the other option, so he had wanted inconclusive. So that was acceptable to them. And we also, not only do we have inconclusive, there is a supporting statement that says it's inconclusive, failed to meet acceptance criteria for identification, or if there is an internal standard issue, we have another statement for that. So it's not just inconclusive. But we are looking at that, making sure that we've done every option possible to reduce the amount of inconclusives that we're putting out.
Okay. It was just more for, does there need to be a change in the standardization document? But
I was going to discuss it with the Tox Twig to see if people have additional suggestions. Because, I mean, we always go and look at our standardized reporting. And then I think it's just making sure the end user understands. I know there is not in New York State outside reference laboratory, and they just said testing canceled. And to me, I think inconclusive is better than testing canceled. So I think as long as our end user understands it, then it's acceptable.
But it sounds like you have definitions of
Yeah.
what inconclusive means. So
Yeah.
if it doesn't fit within those definitions, then it's not inconclusive.
Right.
Right. So
Right. I think it's acceptable.
thank you.
Any other questions?
Did you get a new medical examiner?
They're starting in a couple weeks.
All right, thank you. Do I have a motion to renew the New York State accreditation to the Onondaga County Medical Examiner Forensic Toxicology Laboratory in the discipline of forensic toxicology for a period concurrent with their ABFT accreditation? Motion, do I have a second? Judge? All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? And any abstentions? All right, thank you. Next, we have the Westchester County Division of Forensic Toxicology. Again, there is a vote required. I believe Chris Cording is here with us in New York. Is that right? In March, the lab underwent an ABFT reaccreditation inspection. As I read the materials, there were 12 nonconformances and 18 suggestions for improvement. ABFT, as I read it, has extended the lab's accreditation until September 30th of this year, so the lab can remediate or attempt to remediate the 12 nonconformances. So maybe I do have a few questions. Chris, if you could come up. Yeah, so I guess first, just generally, 12 nonconformances, seems to jump out at me as more than we normally see. Could you give us just an overview from your perspective on why the nonconformances and what progress you're making in terms of addressing the items?
The nonconformances basically fall into two categories. One of them is validation. Inspectors weren't always happy with the way we summarized our validations. They were performed, but they weren't written in a easy to comprehend fashion. And the other is we have practices that aren't procedures. For example, we had a finding that we did not have a procedure for deviation from methods. We have a situation currently where we have a medical examiner sample where no blood was submitted, so we screen the tissues that were submitted. Technically, that's a deviation from our written protocols, but it's not written that we have a procedure that we can do that. So that was something that we addressed. So those are most of the findings that we had. A lot of it, again, relates to the transition to ISO 17025. ABFT doesn't necessarily have requirements as stringent as 17025 for how you write your procedures. We are transitioning to that to make things more clear. We've addressed at least 7 of the findings. That I sent that to DCJS.
There's a couple of, I'm reading this right, that look like they mirror corrective actions from I think 2017 possibly, one relating to nonconformance for cocaine assays, and another one relating to serum controls used for vitreous humor. And I'm a little unclear, are these things that were supposed to be addressed in 2017 that still haven't been addressed?
The cocaine and opiate, we had historical data showing that We didn't need to matrix match our QC. The inspectors didn't like that, so rather than just going with the historical data, we're validating that now just to get that out of the way. The serum controls for the vitreous, we've done a validation. Again, they didn't like our summary, so I'm pulling all the data together, putting it into a better summary so that would satisfy that finding.
Anyone else have questions?
So the issue with J3 and the vitreous humor, that's something that you actually completed. I'm sorry. It's on page of this document. It's on page. Is it 450? The red number is 441, and the actual page is 442.
Down a little bit.
This one?
Right
Okay,
there.
thank you.
So it's just something that's come up. The commissioner just stated something that's come up quite some time. I think the issue was that they were using blood.
No, so the analysis is designed for urine. So we run it for vitreous. We run a vitreous proficiency. We've passed the proficiency. Now I do know that with the glucose, we just missed the proficiency. So we've made a few changes. We have the data, we have the precision and accuracy and bias, but we never summarized it. It's one of the few QCs that we don't put into Excel. It's going into Excel as we speak, so that I can have a summary and show precision, accuracy, and bias for the inspectors. That's the major problem. The last inspection, they did not like the verbiage we put on our reports for the vitreous. I've changed that to indicate that all the results are plus or minus 30% based upon our QC and our proficiency findings. I've discussed that with the medical examiners, and they're okay with that. So that at least clarifies the limitations of our testing.
It sounds like it's something that all Tox Labs were struggling with. So, but it wasn't just Westchester. I thought it was.
It's difficult to. There's no blank vitreouses we can test. We can test blank urine, we can test blank blood. There's no such thing as a blank vitreous. So we can test it for glucose as a blank. That we were able to do. We have an in-house glucose control now that was added since the last inspection. But to do creatinine matrix testing on vitreous is impossible because you can't get vitreous that doesn't have creatinine in it. So we're relying on proficiency data and our QC data to satisfy the validation. But again, it was never summarized in the past, so that's what we're working on right now to satisfy that.
Okay, it sounds positive though. It's something that I know the last director was struggling with to try to get a control set and a procedure set. So, excellent.
Other questions?
What's the? I guess the only ultimate question is what's the turnaround time? When are they supposed? Is it a reiterative approach, or you're sending the stuff back to them, and ANAB is going to get back to you in terms of whether you've complied?
Basically, when I made my remediation plan, I showed them what I've already remediated, and I said within 30 days we'd have X done, 60 days. So the 30 days has just passed, so I will be sending a report to ABFT with what I've finished on this list and an update on what I'm still working on. So I hope to get this all done by the end of the month, and that should hopefully satisfy ABFT.
Hey, just, can you assure us that the lab's running properly, and is this more of an issue with getting paperwork straightened out to satisfy this, the way it's transitioning over? I mean, can you just assure us that...
Yes. The quality of the work we do, in my opinion, is beyond reproach. The way we document it needs to be tightened up. We are transitioning to 17025 like every tox lab. Their rules are more stringent. I can only speak for myself as a director, and that's the direction I'm moving in. I come from a QA background, so I'm more anally retentive than my predecessor. So the quality is there. It's just how we show the quality needs to be improved.
So basically you just need to tighten up the paperwork.
Yes.
Are you confident by the next commission meeting that you'll have the nonconformances addressed to
Yes.
ASP's satisfaction?
Yes.
And I just, with one suggestion, as I read it, there was a suggestion or suggestions relating to the size of the lab, and pointing out, I think they made reference to the lab being small, and undersized, I guess, and talked about it needing to be updated. What's your perspective on that?
We're functional. Obviously, I'd love a new facility. Who wouldn't? I've been in this facility now for 26 years. Of course, it could be upgraded, but it is functional. You know, we work within the space that we have. We've gotten some ductless hoods to increase our extraction room. And if we didn't get an upgrade, we'd still be able to function properly.
And to Scott, you know, I think his question is the ultimate question. Are you confident that, you know, if need be, you can operate a lab that meets the ABFT and ultimately ANAB standards within your current facility?
Yes.
Any other questions? What I would suggest, since there are a number of nonconformances that have to be addressed, and that ABFT has extended through September 30th, I would suggest that we extend the accreditation till the next meeting of the commission, rather than give it a date, with the understanding that our expectation would be that the nonconformances would all be addressed by the next meeting. So,
I would second that.
all right, so I'll formally make a motion that we extend the accreditation of the Westchester County Division of Forensic Toxicology until the next meeting of the Commission on Forensic Science. And Scott, you second?
Yep.
Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? And any abstentions? And thank you, Chris. Appreciate the work you're doing. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
I believe that's the end of our votes for this section of the agenda. For informational purposes, we have the CV for the new QA manager. Is that for the Westchester? Okay. All right.
Mike, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sorry. Just thinking, if we at our next meeting we don't have a quorum, you had said to the next commission meeting, that's what we just made it. Just in case, because I know we were talking earlier, we don't
Sure.
have a quorum.
Yeah, so we'll re-vote. I'll make a motion that we extend the New York State accreditation of the Westchester County Division of Forensic Toxicology until the next meeting of the Commission on Forensic Science, at which there's a quorum of commissioners, so that we can vote on the issue.
Does that supersede the September 30th date?
Well, no, the September 30th date is the ABFT date. We never put that in ours.
Okay.
So they've done what they've done. I just don't want to put a date on it because, you know, something happens, we can't have a meeting. I think yours is even better. So do I have a second for that motion? Second, all in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, and any abstentions? All right, that carries. Thank you. So then, in the materials, just for informational purposes, we did have Chris's CV and also a letter with regard to the new QA meeting from May 9th of this year. Next item we have is the Erie County Medical Examiner's Office, a forensic toxicology laboratory. There's a number of letters from March, April, and May of this year. They pertain to the mid-cycle on-site inspection that the Commission had requested ABFT conduct. ABFT did conduct a visit on May 8th and May 9th. As I read the documentation, it did not flag any issues for us and indicated based on their on-site visit that the laboratory, in their view, remains in compliance with its accreditation. Any questions on that, I believe Christine Giffen is available by phone if we need her. All right, next we have the Monroe County Crime Lab. And there's a letter in your materials dated May 7th of this year, a continuation of their accreditation with an attached off-site surveillance report. Again, this is for informational purposes. There were no findings, as I read it, as a result of that off-site assessment, and the lab continues to be in compliance. Any questions with regard to this item? Next, we have the Monroe County Medical Examiner Toxicology Laboratory. Again, for informational purposes, Director Rebecca Hartman is available by phone if we need her. This was a mid-cycle self-assessment checklist submitted by the lab to ABFT, I believe in preparation for the off-site assessment. Any questions? Next, we have the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, Forensic Biology Laboratory. And there's an email in your materials from March 19th of this year regarding new accreditation expiration time frame. This is for informational purposes. There's no vote required. But this fall, the lab will be undergoing a reaccreditation assessment, and they have enough time for all the assessment-related activities. ANAB extended the expiration date from November 28th of this year to February 28th of 2020. The certificate and scope have been updated to reflect those changes. Any questions? Next, we have the New York City Police Department Police Laboratory. We have an email from March 18th of this year regarding change in key management. Notification that Lieutenant Kathleen Van Buren is the new Integrity Control Officer. I don't know, Scott, anything you want to add?
I think so.
All right, any questions? Thank you. Next is the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services Latent Print Laboratory. There's an email from April 11th of 2019 related to a transition to AR 3125 with attached new scope and certificate. The lab received new documents to reflect those changes. And we do have Charlie Clark, who's the acting director, I believe, with us in Albany, if anyone does have any questions. Next, we have the Suffolk County Medical Examiner Toxicology Laboratory. We have Bob Jenna here with us. This is a mid-cycle self-assessment checklist submitted by the laboratory to ABFT to conduct the off-site assessment. Any questions for Bob? Next, we have the Erie County Central Police Services Laboratory. There's an email from May 29th in the materials regarding an off-site assessment report and continuation of accreditation. Again, no vote required, but in April, the lab had an off-site review, received no findings, indicate they continue to remain in compliance. Any questions? Next, we have the Westchester County Division of Forensic Services. Letter in your materials dated May 21st of this year regarding continued compliance. In January, the lab had its off-site review, received no findings. They continue to remain in compliance. We did receive an updated version of their certificate and scope. Any questions or comments? All right, so that takes care of the accreditations and mid-cycle inspections. So next we have old business. The first issue is Nassau County Laboratory Building Project. We've discussed this at several of our meetings. There's correspondence from February, March, and April. In your materials relates to a letter that I believe the Commission directed that we write to the lab, to the county, in response we received back. A response from Deputy County Executive Fox with regard to the county's support for the accreditation program. I know the Commission was concerned to make sure that people in the county were aware of the prior history. Deputy County Executive Fox called me personally to assure me that was very familiar with the history and that they were doing everything they could to support the laboratory. So I don't know, Pat, if you have anything you want to add to the material?
Other than we have a date of June 30th to leave the Emmys office and go live in the new building. We actually took a case in this week just to look at our evidence intake system and so forth, see how that's working. So we're progressing. We're progressing. We now have a firearm examiner. We're pushing to get the firearm section up and running with individuals. We're going to begin with operability and so forth, but we're taking it one step at a time. But we're progressing well.
And I trust you keep us updated.
Yes.
Anyone have any questions? Next is familial search. Joe, I believe you have an update for us.
So the total number of applications that have been submitted for familial search is 31. That includes 4 resubmissions for a total of 27 unique applications. The reason why is 4 of the submissions were rejected. That brings it up to 31. So, but out of the 27 unique ones, 4 were rejected. 16 were approved. Out of the 16, 6 searches have been completed, which means that the results were released and trainings were provided to the district attorneys and law enforcement. There are 9 in the search queue, and 1 is still pending the memorandum of understanding execution. 1 application was withdrawn, and there are 6 other in various stages of review in the process.
Any questions?
It's fantastic.
Is everything?
Are we tracking? So I know there's all this work that goes into releasing the results back to the requester. Are we then tracking anything about outcomes?
Yeah, so there is a required update. We do ask that they submit an update to the investigation.
So do we know what's happened with the 6 that are done and out and trainings completed?
We do not have an update
on any of them yet. Okay, but that would be a piece of the ongoing report.
Yes.
If you had any, okay.
Yes.
Does that mean, Jill, that assuming the sample is actually from the perpetrator, does that mean that you've identified 6 relatives that are in CODIS, 6 possible relatives of the perpetrator?
So when we say that we've conducted 6 trainings, that
Right.
does not mean that there were necessarily names released in each of those. Just that the familial search had been completed using the validated method by the state police.
In some of them, there were names released, and in others, based on the search, there was nothing released.
Why would you train somebody if they?
Because the way we wrote the regs requires training before anything can be disclosed.
Yeah.
You know, we can, I think we indicated at the end of this year we were going to revisit the regs.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's certainly something we can talk about whether or not, you know, it merits changing.
You could argue that completing the training before you tell them you didn't find anything is not necessarily a bad thing, because it tells them all that was done and
try
why.
telling that to the guy that had to sit there for 3 hours. Yeah.
Well,
okay, I'm ready. I got my training. We didn't find nothing.
You know, we've tried to be a little more flexible with trainings where that's the result, and maybe offer people the opportunity to do it by video conference or something, so they don't have to travel. You know, whereas we're going to be releasing names, you know, we've tried to be a little more stringent. You know, but I think, as you indicated, I think there certainly is an argument that there's some value in making sure that people understand the meaning of whatever they're told as a result of this process.
And of course, in any one of the cases where you did find something, you could have found many relatives of possible relatives.
All right, we
Mike?
continue to update the commission at every meeting.
Mike?
Lydia.
So when we do this review at the end of the year, are we going to have something a little more substantive to look at, to instead of just this general overview like successes, failures, number of labs? I think I'd like something a little more of substance if we're going to vet this to continue to move forward. So I don't know what that would consist of, but I think I'd like a little more than just the general overview that we've been getting.
And I think it's a reasonable request, and we'll just have to look at it, make sure we balance, in cases where results, in all of these cases, they're open investigations, so, we'll certainly look at it, and I think there's a way to balance both of those issues.
I understand what you're saying, but if we're going to say, yes, it's working, move forward, or no, this needs to be tweaked, or, hey, we need to stop, then I want to know how how it is that it's working well that would allow us to continue, what needs to be tweaked, et cetera.
Yeah,
And that could include feedback from who we're dealing with, the customers who are asking, who are going through the training. How are they dealing with that? What sort of expectations did they have that maybe are or aren't being fulfilled? What's the difference between familial searching and partial matches? Maybe that sort of thing. But general broad strokes.
I'm sure we beat them over the head with that during the training.
Okay.
But no, I hear your point. I think there are things that are worth our revisiting that don't really have anything to do with the details of the training. For example, the cases like, for example, we wrote the policy in a way that I think currently excludes testing to identify an unidentified remains. That might be an issue that we want to, and we did have an application where someone was asking, to use the testing for that purpose, and based on the way it was written, we had to say, no, it doesn't qualify. So that type of thing, among other things, something, not expressing any opinion about whether we do it or not, but I think it's at least worth talking about issues like that. That certainly didn't occur to me at the time we're going through the process that have come up. But we'll prepare as much information as we can for the commission, and next time we have a little bit of lull in our agenda, either at the end of the year, beginning of next year, we'll put this on for review.
Thank you.
Related to that, have you had requests from media for an update of how this is? No.
Not that I'm aware of.
Because as of now, you've got data that says we have a system. We're making it work. As far as we know to date, it's not led to any case resolution. Right? That would be a fair comment.
That I'm aware of.
Right, that we're aware of. A lot of work.
There's a lot of work currently being done.
Huge amount of work. Yeah. Okay.
This whole business of a fair and efficient criminal justice system is a lot of
Oh,
work.
well,
isn't it?
that's right.
I'm sure DA Fitzpatrick will test too.
Don't get me started. about as much planning as 10-cent beer night at Cleveland Stadium.
How about Dollar Dog?
That's a
Dollar Dog
historical
night.
day, boy. I wish I was there.
So with that, we'll move on to new
Dollar
business.
Dog night tonight, actually.
First issue we
I haven't
have
heard
under
that
new
song.
business relates to New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, an application regarding rapid DNA validation, or what was the other term that was used?
Enhanced performance.
Enhanced performance check. The New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner did do a presentation to the DNA subcommittee with regard to the enhanced performance check or validation. I didn't attend in person. I did listen to the meeting and listen to the presentation. It was my understanding that the application was to use rapid DNA with regard to reference samples for disaster victim identification, and that based on the application, the scope of the application for that purpose, and based on the either validation study or enhanced performance check, the DNA subcommittee has made a binding recommendation to this commission. So any questions with regard to this? And if you do have, who is it that wants to speak? And I'll speak up. Why don't you go ahead and just come up to the table?
I'd be very curious as to the definition and the distinction between an enhanced performance check and an assay validation for a previously unused instrument and methodology.
That was my question. So,
I think that was a term that was coined by the DNA subcommittee, and it was, I guess it's a tribute to the validation that we've done. So the FBI has a recommendation letter as to what a performance check is required for a rapid DNA system. In it, it only requires one chip. One chip validation, meaning, we do a couple samples in there and then that's more than enough. We went a little bit above and beyond. We did 5 or 6 chips to test sensitivity, accuracy, to make sure that everything is reliable when we obtain it from reference swabs. So that's what the DNA subcommittee was referring to when they indicated that was an enhanced performance check.
And so you have this machine, it's a black box with a chip, right, that you have no control over. You're buying it from a vendor, right? Relying on their QC production. So you run a reference sample, presumably one you created and now one you're loading into the system. Comparison of your rapid black box device to standard methodology, is that part of the validation?
Yes. We compare, so the enhanced performance check, as the DNA subcommittee referred to it, we used reference samples that we created on our own, that we know what the DNA profile would be, using the traditional method of testing, and we used it on the the rapid DNA instrumentation. We compared the results, and they're concordant to each other.
And the FBI thinks you can run one chip, and if you get the same answer as your old methodology, you can use the machine?
In the letter, yes, that's what it states.
And what kind of training do you have to provide to the staff? I'm at a loss that would be considered adequate. You have a new black box that you're relying on the manufacturer for. You're not reverse engineering it. I'm not saying you should.
Right.
You're not taking it apart. You don't know when it went into it other than what they market to you. Now, you're a lab. You know lab practice.
Yes.
You have lab-trained personnel. You have a supervisor. You have a hierarchy for review of results, for handling of specimens. What we're hearing is that there are entities that are not labs that in the future are going to come before this group and ask to use this instrumentation in the field, perhaps. I'm concerned that we set rigorous standards up front to avoid that. Not being biased about other people wanting to use it, but so, I mean, I have no doubt that you performance checked the new machine, but I think we should somewhere have a definition from the DNA subcommittee of what they see as the distinction and whether they would consider this performance check against standard methodology acceptable in a laboratory context, or whether they're going to consider it police department runs one chip and says, oh, I know how to get DNA results. They have no reference result to compare to. They have.
Before you answer, I just want to take a break for 1 minute. I know Richard White, I think, wants to address the commission.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say, and I've got to leave for something at 10, that, again, I see many friends here in the room that obviously I see on a regular occasion, Bill and Scott, and I see my old friend Florence there. But on behalf of the governor and the Office of Public Safety, as many of you know, I have some 25 commissions and boards that I oversee. The work done by this commission under the leadership of Mike and his team is significant. He reports back. He is on my back constantly about the stuff you all need in that instance. And when I heard about this particular meeting, especially with the familiar DNA, the aspects that we're sort of looking around, the added costs, I haven't heard, and he'll report back to me about the bail, the changes on speedy trial and bail, and how that reports to the lab. Your work is not lost. And again, I don't get a chance to sit in on the meetings, but I do hear back from Mike and the team. And again, on behalf of the governor and myself, I really wanted to just thank you all for the work that you all do. It's significant, it's important, and I know I appreciate it. I appreciate Mike's leadership, and I appreciate everyone's leadership here. So again, good to see old friends, always, all the time in that instance. And again, I thank you all for your work. So have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too.
So, Ann, a lot of your points, I kind of come at them from a little different angle, but I clearly hear what you're saying. And as I look at this application, a couple things. I think given the concerns you've raised, this is a situation where anytime someone wants to use this, it should go before the subcommittee and should come before this commission. That whatever we do, if we do approve anything, I would want to make sure it is very limited, so it's understood as limited to this lab for this particular use. Because as you indicated, using it in a lab environment is one thing, using it out in the field is another. But also, from my perspective, using it on reference samples for disaster victim identification is very different than using it on forensic samples that might be mixtures at a scene. So I hear what you're saying, and if in fact we do anything here, I would just want to make sure that we make it very clear that it is limited to the facts of this particular application, and any other application by any other entity to use it for any purpose needs to go through the exact same process that this one did. But that being said, I don't know if you have anything that you want to say to address the points that Ann raised.
I mean, the commissioner raises some good points, but I don't know whether or not I can answer any questions of your concerns. I can only say that for our application, we are using it for mass disaster responses, for family reference samples, and that's all I can say unless there's a specific question for me on that.
All of which I would assume you'd anticipate would be, single donor profiles and, barring some very unusual situation, complete profiles.
Absolutely.
How many, just out of curiosity, when you did this enhanced performance check, and Ann asked you about, running it through the machine and then doing the traditional and comparing the results, how many times did you do that?
So we ran 5 chips. Each chip is about 6 samples. So there's if I remember correctly, there's a positive control lane in there. So 25 samples through just to make sure that it's concordant. And these are all known reference samples. So 25 times in terms of their concordance, we feel that that will be sufficient. And since we've had advice from the FBI regarding how to validate this, and their recommendation is one chip is enough, and more so because it's a closed system. If you can see it, it's a laboratory in a box. It's meant to be rugged, meant to be used by the military to be able to take it from one location to the other. So that's what I think is the reason why they say one chip is enough. We've did more than that to be able to confirm that reference samples come up with the same and concordant profiles.
Did all of those samples that you ran on all of the chips come up with the same results as the traditional testing?
Yes.
Maybe you can answer the question. How does the the FBI having made the recommendation, how do they anticipate this being used, other than in a military event?
I don't know how they anticipate it to be used. I know that it's been said that this was made for non-laboratory settings, but we're using it in a laboratory setting to be able to enhance the mass disaster response.
And one thing Ann asked you that you didn't, it probably got lost, but what about the training? What kind of training, what do you have in place in terms of requirements before someone uses this?
We see this just like any traditional method. Anybody has to go through a training to be able to learn how to run the instrument, learn how to receive and interpret the results from the instrument. And once the results are there, it's much like a traditional method. I mean, it's DNA, an STR-DNA profile. So, we can make comparisons through the same way through a traditional method. So in terms of producing a DNA profile up until the end, we will have a training program in place to be able to show the user how to use it. Within the laboratory setting, most of the people that we're training are already DNA analysts. So these are all experts in DNA that will be using this instrument.
Ann, I know you had a question.
Yeah, I just have a couple. One piece of clarification is this is rapid DNA versus a modified rapid DNA, meaning do you have a human looking at the results that come out?
No. Right now we're all using the expert system that comes with the rapid DNA. So when the results come out, those are the results. We don't have a human looking at that final result in terms of interpretation. But the good thing about having doing this in a DNA laboratory is that we have a DNA expert looking at that final result and can also look at the final DNA profile, the electropherograms, to be able to confirm everything at the end. So it's even though this is we're using it as a rapid DNA system, not a modified rapid DNA system. The benefit of using it in my laboratory is that I have DNA experts being able to review kind of what the machine already reviewed, like a second confirmation. So we're using it in that same manner.
And then, so your only intention is to use this in the case of mass casualties?
As of this time, yes. We have no intentions in using it in casework at this time. My interpretation of the quality assurance standards, there's limitations in there to be able to use this on casework at this point in time. Unless the FBI advises us otherwise via the standards or anything, I don't think we're opening it up to casework at all. We're going to use this for mass disaster response to hopefully be able to give family members a faster closure.
So let's say there's no mass casualty event for 7 years. You would recheck, you would do some sort of another, at least short QC to make sure that nothing has happened to the chemistry over those 5 years before you actually implemented it?
The manufacturer has set guidelines for us as to what happens if an instrument has been idle for too long. These chips also have lot numbers and expiration dates. Mm-hmm. So if something doesn't happen for 7 years, which is what I hope, we would have to re-QC all the chips that come in, and we have to make sure that the instruments are in operational manner.
And do you feel like the manufacturer is fairly transparent about any changes, modifications to their system over time?
As of this time, yes.
So that you would know if there was a significant change to
yes.
a kit. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Mike, I just got a question. It's not a question for Gene, but I still don't get the enhanced performance check versus internal validation distinction. And then on the next page, the DNA subcommittee is saying it doesn't matter. You can do either one. So let's not kid ourselves. This is going to be used in casework, or some police agency, probably NYPD, although I don't want to speculate, is going to go before the DNA subcommittee. And is that going to, if the DNA subcommittee writes us one of these letters, it's binding on us? We have to just say.
No. What binding means is we don't have the ability to modify it. We can either accept it or we can send it back.
Okay.
So if we don't like it, and we've done this plenty of times in the past, what we can't do is say, okay, they recommended approval for this use, but we're going to expand it and say go ahead and use it for everything. But we're going to,
Okay.
And I think it's important, you know what, on the next page, but, as part of the discussion, the next item on the agenda is the DNA subcommittee sent us a second letter that, as I read it, said basically that while they are making a recommendation that this application be approved, they're also making a recommendation to us that all future applications by any entity to use this technology need to go before the DNA subcommittee, and whoever brings it before the subcommittee has to present either a validation study or an enhanced performance check to them. So I think the DNA subcommittee, is thinking along the same lines that I expressed earlier, and that they were viewing this not as an approval generally of rapid DNA, but as an approval of this particular use in this particular lab, given what the lab had used for this limited purpose. David,
I
I'll
mean,
get
just
back to you.
just I guess a couple of observations or questions, and I only saw the presentation on video, so I don't know fully like what was. I didn't see the screen as the presentation was going on, but it just seems that the machine that they're using, the Andy 600, has certain claims, and I don't know that they've verified all the claims, and I do appreciate that it's for reference samples only, but the reference samples aren't, and well, I don't really know how the reference samples are going to come in. I don't think they're going to be from folks in the lab. I think they are going to be people whose loved ones, and they want to find information. I don't know whether those are swabs they're going to be taking themselves and sending them into the lab, or they're going to be coming down to the OCME to do it. All that's really not clear, and that takes, I guess, then there's a concern about, whether the reference samples are contaminated, whether or not you have more than one profile in the reference sample, and I didn't really hear anything about, this check or whatever that went to. I know the machine is supposed to turn off or give some indication when there is a mixture, or that if there's a partial profile that something is supposed to happen, or when there's some form of contamination that the machine is supposed to do something. And I didn't hear any of that, at least from looking at it on video, that was going on. I don't know, there is an expert system there, but it's a machine that's doing DNA testing. Like if the OCME had brought True Allele, they said, well, we did a performance check, we ran 5 things, and it seemed terrific. So I don't know where we're cutting the difference between a validation study and a performance check. I mean, doing something more than one run through. I mean, it's great, but it's enhanced. What I would like to see from, I guess, the subcommittee is like, what does this machine promise to do? What have we tested it against? And some sort of verification from the OCME about all of that data, rather than sort of, feels like the lab going, we've done this, and there was really not a lot of questioning about other things that could have been done, or the full capacity of the machine, or what the brakes are on the machine, and where are its limits. I know at one point that one of the references swabbed between 1 and 12 times, but it'd be great if we saw what happened when they swabbed 1 time. What's the data on that for 5 different studies? What's the data when they swabbed 12 times? And is the machine doing what they're saying? With the advantage of doing reference samples, obviously, if you lose it, you can get another reference sample. But if you actually have a mass disaster and you have a customer who is a family member, doing a back and forth about what the capability of the machine is, I'd rather do that today, and wait, rather than wait to figure out what the capacities of the machine and how it handles things that aren't concordant with a single profile, with what it seems to be a lot of 6 swabs is a lot of DNA that's necessary to get a result, more so obviously than traditional testing. So I just think that there should be more documentation than, you know, a PowerPoint saying that, you know, that we've used it, a couple of dozen times and, it works. Like, I would like to know what the parameters are and when the machine breaks, or if it never breaks, then that's terrific. But if you have a machine that you have a real mass disaster and you're running it for 12 hours, then it should work for all 12. And so I don't think that's here. I don't know why. I understand the FBI sent a letter and we did more than the letter, and that's terrific. I'm not a scientist. I don't know what the details of the difference between the two are, but I know it's a lot less than we did than Pat's lab just did.
And I think, Eugene, is there anything that you want to say in response to that?
So in response to that, we did run samples. The manufacturer recommends using their swabs, and the user swab 6 times in their buccal, in their cheek area to be able to obtain a profile. We did check to see, well, let's try 1, and then let's try 8, and let's see whether or not a concordant profile can be obtained. And yes, we did that experiment, and that kind of goes into sensitivity of the instrumentation, and we were able to achieve concordant profiles. In terms of whether or not an instrument is still accurate after 12 hours, I mean, we scientifically validated the instrument, or performance checked the instrument in terms of checking to make sure that a single source profile is concordant and accurate. We were able to achieve that goal, and if we're trying to obtain a DNA profile from a reference sample, we know that it's from one person, and if we see contamination, that's something that we will be able to recognize. And I guess that's a good part.
I thought the machine was going to be determining that. I thought the swab was going to be put in the machine.
Yes.
You don't quantify it beforehand. No expert makes a decision beforehand, so it's the machine that's actually making that determination.
Right. So if the machine comes out with a maximum of 2 alleles per locus, then we know we will have a DNA expert looking at the results to be able to see if there's a maximum of 2 alleles per locus. We know that it's from a single source. If there's anything there that might be a little bit more, and also we again, the benefit of using this within a DNA laboratory is I have DNA experts to be able to review any electropherograms that are generated from there, so we can see whether or not there's contamination from this instrumentation.
No, I understand that, but I guess the question is when you did the enhanced performance check, like if it's a different thing whether I'm giving a reference sample than someone who's a scientist that's doing it. I may not, I may smoke, whatever it is. Like it's just the general public, and so the question is whether you tested the capacity of the machine where there was a mixed sample. Like that's, and it's not whether you're. I have every confidence that you guys would be able to recognize, but if we're saying that there was a validation of the machine or a performance check of the machine, it's just a question of whether you guys check that sort of assay or that claim that the machine is making.
Let me have Andrew Schweigart is the scientist that was the lead for this validation. Let me have him answer some of your concerns that hopefully you can see what we did here. Now, if it's more general in terms of concerns, I'm not sure that we can help you in terms of answering those questions, but at least we can help you answer some of the validation questions.
Sure.
Hi. I don't know that I would say there's a difference really between the reference samples that we tested internally from staff members versus those that we might collect in a mass disaster type of scenario from the general public. We've done many studies on many different technologies. There's nothing to corroborate there being a difference between reference samples from scientists versus the general public. It's really just a Q-tip with cotton at the end where we're asking them to swab their cheek. I don't think it's something that requires scientific expertise to ask them to do. The other issue that you had talked about was mixtures. The rapid DNA system works with an expert system. So as the end user, we don't have the ability to manipulate any of the internal settings. We don't do any manual analysis. We don't do any manual interpretation. That's all done by the instrument. And that's why the FBI considers it acceptable to do an enhanced performance check as opposed to a more comprehensive internal validation. So we felt that having just tested the 5 or 6 chips that we did was more than satisfying the FBI's requirements for that performance check. It's true that we didn't study mixtures, but there are extensive developmental validation studies that have been done where things like mixtures and other challenging samples have been tested. But since that's not what we aim to use this instrument for, that's not something that we explored in detail.
But how do you know from today whether tomorrow somebody sent you a reference sample and it's not packaged and there's bacteria in the sample and you have a degraded sample? How do you know what the machine is going to do?
Well, these samples would be collected by scientists at the site of a disaster. They would be collected on a manufacturer's proprietary swab. This is not like a missing persons kit that we're going to be mailing to families.
And so you anticipate all the family members to be in New York City at the time that you're swabbing?
Yeah, can you just give us an example of what you're talking about? I mean, okay, Mashcat, give us an example. A plane accident, a plane crash?
So I wish.
And what are we comparing it to?
Okay, so I wish Mark Desire were here to be able to answer this question. He lived through 9/11. It was intensely involved, and he's done some identification. So I can only tell you in terms of second-hand information. Where let's just say, for example, a mass disaster happens.
Let's use 9/11.
Okay. A family member flies in from Los Angeles, or the parents of a victim fly in from Los Angeles, and they would like to be able to have a little bit of closure and identify their loved ones. Traditional method we can still use, and they will still generate a DNA profile. They'd have to swab. They might go back to their home far away, and they might have to pay for information. What we envision for the benefit of this is that we'll swab them. We'll test it in the rapid DNA instrumentation, and assuming that the loved one's DNA has been developed, we can also compare this within a disaster response and a missing persons database.
So you would have the remains from the disaster.
Yes.
And a family member would give you their DNA, and
Yes.
then you compare them, and you would be able to say, that's your relative? I mean...
No, we would hope to be able to make an identification to say that we found your loved one, to be able to give them that closure before they left.
Now let me ask you the next question. As a prosecutor, that disaster is a criminal act.
Mm-hmm.
How reliable is what we're talking about? Am I going to be able to call you guys in and say, okay, the remains that you found are Scott McNamara, so that we can prove identity of the victim in a courtroom?
Yes, and here's
is that what we're intending? Because right now it seems kind of like we're out there. Well, we're just identifying remains, but the reality of this, as a prosecutor, is identifying remains when the cause of the disaster is a criminal act is going to be something that is going to make its way into a courtroom.
Let me just jump in here, though. In that scenario, Scott, they use this in the field, or they use it wherever in the lab, and they say to the relative, yes, this technology, we've identified your relative. You now decide, this is a crime and I want to prosecute.
That's my
What
question
says
to them
you
is, would they have to go...
that same swab from that relative? If you're not comfortable with rapid DNA for your criminal case, and you want, the testing that's being used now in a forensic context, you would be free as a prosecutor to get that relative to give you another sample, submit it to the lab, and have them use a different methodology for your criminal case, wouldn't you?
Was it the same
That's
profile?
kind of my question. My next question to him
it's
was
a
going
CODIS
to be,
profile?
is that what
Not
we
loading.
would do?
No.
Well, I think
Is
my
this
view
is
that
this
would be up to you as the
consistent?
prosecutor.
You know
Is
what?
this
Up to them.
consistent? Is this consistent? We're talking about a narcotics case where you have the field test, which we all know is kind of okay, but we rely 100% upon the lab, and that's kind of my question here. Is this more of a how do they see it? Do you see this as your final product, or do you see this as an initial thing, and then when we go into the courtroom, you would say, no, we have to do traditional?
Well, I mean,
You understand my question?
I understand your
Okay.
question, and I guess you're asking it from a prosecutor's standpoint, which I fully understand. In terms of the science, I can tell you that the generation of the DNA profile is the same as generation of the profile from the traditional method. What encompasses the similarity, or after that, after the generation of the DNA profile from either technology, the comparison is using the same method. The review of that is by a DNA expert to make sure that comparison is there. So, would you have support to be able to say that, in your scenario, yes, it is supported and the system is performance check and validated to be able to generate a reliable DNA profile?
Eugene, if I could ask you a question. So, in this instance of the mass disaster, the victims, would that be done traditional testing?
Yes.
Right. So victims would be traditional testing.
Yes.
The family members would be, the family members of the victims would be the rapid DNA testing. You would generate two profiles, one from the victim using the traditional method, and an equivalent DNA profile from the relative, and then you would do an interpretation to see if they were related?
Yes.
Right. And then, just to go back, when you said the enhanced performance check, I'm sorry, I never caught the other gentleman's name.
My name is Andrew Schweikart.
Andrew, you said the FBI said enhanced performance check. Is that an FBI language, or is it the DNA subcommittee language?
The enhanced
performance
performance check.
Because he said FBI, I just want you to double check.
The enhanced performance check is a DNA subcommittee language.
Okay.
The FBI only requires a performance check.
Right.
There is a specific definition for internal validation and developmental validation as defined by the DNA quality assurance standards. The FBI does not recommend that we go that in depth in terms of that because it's a closed system. So
that internal validation, the FBI and their quality assurance documents define what that is, correct? Is that what you just said?
What an internal validation is.
Yeah, right. And they said that a performance check was sufficient, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you did what you thought was a validation, but it was readdressed by the DNA subcommittee as their own terminology, an enhanced performance check. I don't mean to. I'm not trying to.
No. I know
understand.
it's the terminologies here that might be confusing. We did not do as extensive as it would be for an internal validation.
Right. Okay.
But we did a little bit. Well, we did more than what the FBI prescribed
but
for
the
a
point
rapid
is, I think we're getting to the point of which I'm getting confused with. I'm not a DNA examiner, so let's be clear. Is the ensured, whatever way they did it, that this instrument works. That's it. That's it. That's what they did. They made sure this instrument works, and because it's a closed system, there's not much for them to change and alter. When you do a validation, you're validating, you're checking the parameters you can change and what impact they have. But in this system, it's a closed system where, and again, I've never seen it, I've never used it, is you're simply taking a swab and placing it into the system, and the system is doing everything. So you were verifying, will the system provide a DNA profile? And the answer was yes. And as you said, when you were determined for single source, because that's your application of it, single source, it provided that profile. And that profile is just as good as a profile from the traditional method.
Yes.
So I know we get with validations, performance check, enhanced, but this is a closed system that a manufacturer's provide, just like the manufacturer. What instrument is called that you use for traditional testing? What's that called?
There's plenty of them.
Capillary
electrophoresis.
So
I'm sorry.
That capillary electrophoresis is an instrument that a vendor made that comes into the laboratory that they do a performance check on the equipment to make sure it's working, and then they have their own parameters where they come up with a validation packet for it. So we do want to make sure that the quality of the work is high, But I think I'm getting confused with the choice of the words. And again, even in the second letter, when they say enhanced performance check and/or validation, it would appear that the FBI, who writes the standards for DNA testing in the United States, is saying you can't do an internal validation because it's not your product. You can't change anything. So the best you can do is a performance check, which they're apparently recommending one chip which takes 6 samples, where the OCME went and did more.
Yeah, and as I understand what the DNA subcommittee was saying is that, they used the word enhanced to reflect the fact that they didn't just run one chip. They ran, 5 chips or 6 chips. And I believe what they were indicating is that all they're saying now is they have a comfort level with that level of checking. And they didn't want to say if someone comes to us with just the one chip, we're okay with that. In fact, I think they were trying to make clear that they're not, that we expect that if anyone comes to us in the future, at a minimum, we expect that they will do what the OCME did or more. And I appreciate the way you put it, because as a non-scientist, I struggle to wrap my arms around those different terms. But I think you're right. When we think of validation studies, we think of, for example, trying to interpret mixtures. And we say, well, when you did your validation, did you account for mixture of 2, mixture of 3, mixture of 4? And there's so many different variables. Those variables don't exist in this context, as you said. It's, you're looking at a system and you're saying, and I still, to your question, Scott, my feeling is that I don't really think it's fair to put that question to the lab folks, because at the end of the day, I think that's a question for a prosecutor. And I know if I were the prosecutor, I know what I would do.
Well, I know what I would do too. I guess my
criminal case, as opposed to giving a victim's relative a quick answer. I see those as two very different things, and I see the DNA subcommittee is saying, we're saying it's okay in this one context for this one lab under these conditions for this thing, not anything else. And if we do anything as a commission, I would limit it to that one thing as well, and I wouldn't go beyond it.
I agree with you 100%, but what I'm not trying to put him on the spot at all. What I'm presupposing is the next step. And I just want to feel comfortable that what we're doing today isn't going to open up a situation for other people to come to us. And if they are going to do that, then I'm comfortable with what direction we're going to go with that. That's the only reason. As a prosecutor, and Bill and I were talking about it, initially I'm thinking of this as like a Veltox test, or even the test on the side of the road for DWI. But what I'm looking at is what's the next step? Who's coming next to us?
And I guess I'm looking at it that we're not deciding, we're deciding this application, as I'm looking at this, they've asked to use this technology, given the checking they did for this particular purpose, and we're saying yes or no to that. And if we say yes, for my own comfort level, I would want to make very clear that we're not saying yes to anybody else, and we're not saying yes for any other purpose. So if they want to use it for any other purpose other than this, they have to come back. And if anybody else wants to use it for any purpose, they need to come in. So I hear what you're saying. I share the concerns, but I'm not looking at it as if we say yes to this, we're opening the door wide open.
Well, sorry.
Yeah,
Judge, you're trying to get in.
Well, I see some implications here for civil litigation. After 9/11, we had a whole spate of cases as to whether or not someone was actually dead, and whether or not the life insurance had to be paid, whether the person was, in the wind or was actually killed in the attack. And this has a lot of implications in civil litigation, as you can imagine, not just for insurance, but for all sorts of other things. So, is this a determination to the family? Yes, this person is dead. Now I can go get married again, or I can collect the insurance. I can do all. I can sell the house. I can do all sorts of things here.
As to the litigation and lawsuit, and I want to collect money and it's contested, again, if I'm the civil lawyer, if I have any discomfort with that process, I get a second sample from my client and I have it tested using the traditional method, and I use that when we go to court. I don't see that any of this testing binds any litigant.
So this is just this is really sort of a preliminary test to quiet concerns.
Or to give some comfort.
Yeah.
Either yes
But
or no.
it's not intended to be used in any litigation, criminal or civil.
I guess I don't go that far. I don't know. I guess that's up to a lawyer. It's up to a prosecutor, or it's up to a civil litigant to decide if they want to rely on it or if they want to get another test. But if they choose to rely on it, they do it at their own peril, because I don't think that it's ever been litigated in New York. And I think you'd probably wind up having a Frye hearing possibly. And
yeah, you would.
Yeah, and so rather, I'm just saying, if I were the litigant, I wouldn't take that chance. I would get a second reference sample from my client, or if I'm the prosecutor, from the victim's relative, I'd have it tested using a method that's already been accepted, so I wouldn't have to go through a Frye hearing.
It's usually the insurance company that's resisting.
Yeah, and so if I'm litigating on behalf of the victim's family and I'm going up against an insurance company and they've done this type of testing, as I see it, I've got a couple of choices. One is I can rely on this and take the chance I have to do a Frye hearing, or I can just say to my client, hey, give me a second sample. I can have that tested using a methodology that's already been accepted in the New York courts, and then litigate that, and this test never becomes an issue. As I view this current application, they're saying we want to use it for identification of remains to give victims' families some solace at the scene, or relatively as close to the incident as we can. And I just don't see that as binding the hands of a prosecutor or a civil litigant. So they're not bound to use this, because we're not using. That's where I draw the difference between using this at a crime scene on forensic samples, because then you have issues of, are you using the whole sample? Is there anything left? Whereas if you're talking about doing this on a cheek swab, I suppose, on the outside chance that the person relative you're swabbing dies between the time you take that swab and the other, but the problem would be another relative. So I just see this as very different than the forensic, where are you using the only sample.
Can I jump in, Scott?
Yeah.
Sure.
I worked on at least 3 mass disasters: 9/11, Flight 587, and Staten Island ferry crash. And one thing that I know is that just like with evidence samples, every mass disaster sample is different. So the concern about giving a quick answer, there is not going to be a quick answer necessarily when it comes to identifying the remains of someone who's died in a mass disaster, because if they've burned, or if the sample is compromised in any way, that sample can't go on this instrument. The sample from the victim has to be analyzed using conventional methods. So with the using of the known sample from a loved one, and this is another thing. One of the things that we ran into, if that person has died in a mass disaster, then we can't do a direct comparison to a known sample from them. We're usually doing what's called kinship. So we're getting samples from family members. That takes time. So the only thing, that's why it's such a limited scope upon which this enhanced, what are we calling it now?
Performance check.
Performance check is being vetted. It's for this limited, if we want to get, and we hope that from a buccal sample, a cheek swab, that we're going to get a high quality, high amount of DNA, single source profile, to which we would then do a comparison to what could be a compromised sample. By the same token, with evidence samples from crime scenes, they are all different qualities. So we can't expect that the type of profile that we could get from a clean, unmixed blood sample, that could probably be run in this box and get a single source profile, but then you can get all different types of samples that would end up being what would be deemed a mixture, and that's not suitable, can't be run in this box. So I think that it's good to talk about what it can do, but I would say rest assured that it can't do a whole lot more than just these single sources just now, and that the evidence samples that everyone is concerned with for either civil or criminal litigation are going to have to be run using conventional methods. So I wouldn't be concerned about the quality of the results that are coming from either system. And I mean, I am in the same laboratory that vetted this system, and we do tend to go beyond what is asked for because we want to feel confident in what it is that we're seeing coming out the back end. So I just wanted to say that.
Who has not, is there anyone who's not had a chance to weigh in yet, who's waiting? All right. Go around a second time.
Well, mine is sort of an unrelated question, but related. In the letter from the DNA subcommittee regarding the future, they talk about submissions from other laboratories. No issue. They then say, and agencies. We've not yet resolved the issue that we have mentioned in the past as to whether an application from a non-laboratory entity would be entertained. And I think at some point we need to give instructions to the DNA subcommittee as to whether or not we will entertain such an application from a non-laboratory entity, or whether the initial bar is, if you want to do DNA analysis, even using this box, you are by definition a laboratory under this commission, and you have to meet that standard first. That will eliminate much of what it's just an issue we will have to address at some time.
I'm guessing that language comes from the fact that we as a commission sent correspondence to every police agency in the state telling them, if you are thinking about doing this, you need to come to the subcommittee and the commission before you do it. The other thing I would say to that is, one option is, yes, we could, deal with it in the abstract, make a decision and tell the DNA subcommittee. The other issue is we can just wait. And if a police agency goes to the DNA subcommittee, let them take the first look at it, and then when it comes to us and we actually have something solid in front of us to look at, we can either say yes, or we can say, you know what, no, we're not going down this road, and send it back to them, and then that's the end of it. I would prefer the second method, but
we had this discussion before, and my preference would be to deal with the to have said to those agencies, if you're going to come, if you want to do this, yes, you're coming to the DNA subcommittee, but by the way, you will by definition become a laboratory. We didn't take that route. We can wait. I hope.
Yeah, I just think it's easier to make that decision in the context of a real case where you have actual facts in front of us. It's just hard to, when you try and look at some of these issues in the abstract, I think it's tough. Just my own personal opinion.
As long as we're aware that it will be an issue if it happens.
It will.
So again, just because I feel I'm getting confused again. So just one thing I want to ask is,
you're getting confused.
As everyone's already said, which I'm not disagreeing with what anyone said, but in regards to the rapid DNA technology, it seems to me it's more about the application of it, not the actual fundamental science behind the instrument. The fundamental science behind the instrument is just as good as the traditional method. And the debate is to do with the application of it. Who's to run the sample and who's to use that data. And I just think, because something that seems to get mixed up, like there's an issue with rapid DNA, that the science behind rapid DNA is somewhat like a color test in a drug case. It is not. It is just as good, and I'm maybe wrong, so I'm looking to you guys because I'm not a DNA person, I'm just trying to understand. A color test in a drug case is a presumptive test, and a GCMS in a laboratory is a confirmatory test. The traditional testing in DNA is a confirmatory test. The rapid DNA is a confirmatory test. There are issues of consuming samples. There are issues of mixtures. Those are other issues, but the fundamental science behind generating a DNA profile for rapid DNA is, my understanding, not a concern. Is that fair?
It's definitely fair. If I can add in a little bit more to that, the science is the same. You're absolutely right that it's a confirmatory test. This is why we have to go through the validation or the performance check to ensure that this system works. Right now, obviously, we're talking about mass disasters, but as a confirmatory test, the return on this investment is that we can obtain a DNA profile, a reliable DNA profile, in about 2 hours' time, while as the traditional method requires 24 to 48 hours in terms of the time frame, business days, to be able to get a DNA profile out because of the traditional method. With the reference sample results in terms of comparisons, we can use this towards a lot of things. Paternity testing. I don't know. I mean, there's a
Paternity testing.
paternity.
Yeah, I heard what you said.
Yeah. I mean, it could be used with that, but we're using it right now for mass disasters. But it's for a laboratory to use.
I think the point is this technology is the future.
I don't think anyone's disagreeing with that. Look, the only thing I'm saying is if it's actually a dispositive test, then sort of like this loose standard of it's not a full validation study. It's not a one-off check, but it's sort of this enhanced thing, and the subcommittee hasn't defined what it believes to be an enhanced test. Like that should be defined before we say, thumbs up or thumbs down, and that, goes through like what the machine claims to do, what the machine claims not to do, and taking it through its paces. I don't disagree that it's not the technology of the future, but saying that it's self-contained is not helpful. Like TrueAllele is a continuous model, and the analysts do very little there. But you would have a full validation study before you used it in the lab. You just would. So, so maybe you don't have a full validation study. You certainly don't have you turn on the television and there's a picture there, so the TV works. Like, the subcommittee should be defining, like, what that is for this particular machine, what the machine claims to do, and the limits of that. That's all I'm saying that we should be asking the subcommittee to do. I'm not saying to reject rapid DNA testing. I'm just saying that, they took it through its pace to do certain things. I didn't hear in the presentation, that, they may never get, a sample that's degraded. They may never get a buccal swab, that's has contamination. They may never get a mixed sample, from, these disasters. I doubt that that's true. But it'd be nice to know that the machine can do what it says when it gets those samples. That's all I'm saying.
I guess I take a little different view in that I look at what the DNA subcommittee did and say, they did they did tell us that there's a minimum bar, and that's what the LCME did in this case. That they've indicated that they expect at least that. I hear what you're saying, and I think your view is different than mine, but I don't view it that they didn't give us any guidance. I think they're saying they expect at least what the LCME did, if anyone else is going to come forward. I think we've, and I guess one last thing I'll add, because you mentioned, Eugene, paternity testing, some other things have been mentioned. I just want to make crystal clear, as I view the decision we have, we have a recommendation with regard to a specific use, and that's reference samples for disaster victim identification. And if we vote on that, and if it gets approved, it is for that purpose only. And if the LCME decides that they want to use it for any other purpose, they would have to come back to the DNA subcommittee and the commission, and we would have to understand what that purpose was and be clear as to whether or not we have a comfort level expanding it. But this issue we have before us is a issue that's limited to these specific facts.
That's understood. The only reason why I mentioned that was I'm just illustrating that it's a confirmatory test and that can be used, but we're not. The application stands as is. We're going to use it for mass disaster response on reference samples only.
I just have one more question. That would be to issue a death certificate, right? That could be used to issue a death certificate.
I'm not sure how the process goes when it comes to issuing a death certificate. I only know that in terms of our validation or performance check, we're generating a reliable profile through validation that could be used also as a comparison with the traditional method. So if using the traditional method, you could issue a death certificate, yes, I believe we can.
The Department of Health issues the death certificate, right?
I'm not sure about that process. I apologize.
Who issues the death certificate?
I think the medical
I'm
examiner.
happy to address that briefly, if I might. I'm Florence Hutner. I'm General Counsel of the OCME. So, Judge, I think that the short answer to your question is that to the extent that identification is a necessary component of making the determination of death, it would contribute to that determination and the signing of the death certificate. You are right that the Department of Health, the Bureau of Vital Statistics, officially issues the death certificate, but in the case of a mass disaster, those death certificates are signed by medical examiners at the OCME. Does that address your question?
Yes, it does.
I'm sorry, I'm just a DNA person.
Just one last thing is just, and that's to do with this particular instrument, meaning vendor. If they get a different vendor, they have to go back in front of the DNA subcommittee. Just because they list the vendor, the Andy 6C Rapid. So if there's
because I think
I don't know.
this instrument is the one that they demonstrated.
Would that be your intention?
At least arguably demonstrated to the DNA subcommittee worked for this purpose.
This is the instrumentation that we're using.
Yeah.
For
So
example,
I'm just trying to clarify. So
absolutely.
I'm assuming 6C. So maybe 6D comes and
Okay.
7C. That would be another presentation to the DNA subcommittee.
New chip.
Because this is something that's new.
Well, because we're being very narrow. I
Right.
don't know how narrow we're going.
No,
That's all.
I guess I would read it that way because if there's a new instrument, we would want to know that was checked and worked to the same level of accuracy for this purpose.
The chip changes, the machine doesn't. So it's the chip and the machine.
Can you describe what the chip is?
Andrew, you want to?
The chip is a little bit smaller than a typical shoebox. It has 5 channels in it, to which 5 different buccal swabs are inserted. Once they're inserted, they can't be removed. And there are very tiny microfluidic channels drilled throughout the chip. That's what keeps the samples spatially separated and totally independent as they flow through the chip. And the chip includes all phases of testing that we would typically see in our conventional testing. So the sample is first extracted. It's not quantified because it's a reference sample and it has a predictable amount of DNA there. It's amplified by PCR, and then it's separated by electrophoresis.
Does that all happen within the chip?
Everything happens within the chip. It's totally contained. The user has no ability, like I said, once that buccal swab is inserted, that cannot be removed. Nothing can be done by the user. And those chips are one-time use, and they're disposed when the run is done.
And are these the same STR loci as in traditional testing?
The rapid DNA instrument actually provides us with data at a few more loci than we would typically see in our conventional testing. But for the purposes of making a kinship analysis or an identification, we would only be looking at those loci at which our conventional test and the rapid DNA overlap.
Why STR too?
I'm sorry?
Why STR? No.
This is not for YCR.
And just one fun, are there any protocols after you have identified the victims and notified family members? Are there any protocols in place for, I guess, the disposition of the DNA? Does it get destroyed? Does the family have to make a request to have it?
What do we usually
You
do?
mean the DNA?
That's
DNA
not
data.
specific to this technology, so I'm not sure exactly what we do with the DNA swabs of the victims. So I mean the family members. So that I'm not.
But it's not stored anywhere. I guess it's.
I'm sorry, could you?
It's not going
Are you
to be
putting them
stored
in your
anywhere,
local?
or are they
No.
going to
No.
be eliminated?
No.
I just want to clarify. You're talking about the physical swab or the
I'm talking
profile?
about the victim, like, sends it to figure out what sends in their you develop a profile from a family member for them to figure out whether their loved one, you to identify a loved one. I'm just trying to figure out what happens to that profile once the case is concluded and there's a definitive association. That's all. And whether that's whether you guys have considered that or whether that's part of your protocol.
Is the question, are you going to keep this in some local database to use to compare other forensic samples against?
No, not other forensic samples. I mean, each disaster response is separate. So the way that I'm envisioning it is that we might keep it in case if we did not find the family member of these, the victim of these family members, we might want to keep it in a location where we could compare in case additional victim DNA profiles come in and are developed through the traditional method. I don't think this is a one-time thing where when a family member comes to us and seeks help to identify their loved ones, we want to try the best as we can and not just do it a one-time deal and say, nope, we didn't find it and that's it. We'd want to store that profile somewhere to be able to say if another sample comes in from the disaster site or the victims, we want to be able to make a comparison and call you right away.
I'm not disagreeing with any of it. It's just that, in the criminal case, they're different. Here, the victim's family is the end consumer, and so there are no lawyers in between them, and so
Not necessarily. I said not necessarily.
I know you did.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I'm just saying there can be other lawyers.
Aim for an elaboration. It's not
You want to get a marriage license. You have to be able to attest how your last marriage was terminated.
Yes, and
that
so
kind of
I guess
thing.
the only concern is that if the consumer is the family member, that they have some connection to whether they want to dispose of it or not dispose of it. That's the only question.
And I guess, a related concern for me is I understand keeping it in the context of the disaster that you're working on, but, I wouldn't want it to be used or kept for any purpose beyond that.
Understood.
So in terms of just maintaining clarity, when this becomes a historical document, should the DNA subcommittee letter indicate this is specifically for use in mass casualties? Because I don't think they say that, although they're very specific about other things. It's 5:30 in red.
Right. Yeah, that's
It's hard.
It doesn't make reference.
Right.
No.
It doesn't say.
I mean, I
No,
read it like 3
it
times to
doesn't
make
say
sure
that.
I wasn't missing something.
It just says buccal swabs from reference samples.
I mean, not to say that it couldn't be approved for other things in the future, but just for clarity in terms of what we're deciding.
Is there a concern that if they did use it, just let's say OCME went ahead and said every exemplar is going to be developed using, and they wouldn't because it's so expensive, you would
Right.
just take every exemplar. Is the concern that they would begin to use the instrument for exemplars and then compare it to the general STR unknowns?
I think it's not necessarily a concern, but I think there's been a desire expressed by the commission to know how it's being used.
Right.
So that, it doesn't start being used for people that are arrested or people that are convinced to give a swab or, I'm just saying, yeah. And
I think reading the letter here, while they don't use those specific words, having listened to the presentation, it was clear that OCME presented for this particular purpose. That was what was in front of the subcommittee. And I think if we choose to accept the recommendation, we can make clear that we're accepting it with the understanding that it is for that
okay, that's
purpose
fine with me.
and no other
Yeah,
purpose.
that's fine.
Any other questions, any other conversation? All right, if not, you know, do I have a motion to accept the recommendation of the DNA subcommittee as contained in the May 20th, 2019 letter to me with regard to the application of the OCME, Department of Forensic Biology, relating to their use of the ANDE 6C system for reference sample STR typing, with the understanding that it is limited to use for the purposes that have been discussed here, specifically, you know, reference samples in mass casualty situations, and nothing beyond that, and is specific to this particular instrument.
Can I make that motion?
Could you repeat?
Oh, sorry. I can make the motion.
You can have the court reporter read it.
That's a long motion. I was going to say.
We have a second? All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, and
I
if-
abstain.
Yes.
I abstain.
All right, one abstention, one in opposition. And it, all right, so there,
Thank you, guys.
that's that issue. Then the next issue we have is a letter from
I
the
love to see
DNA
it.
subcommittee.
Should come over.
We're just going to switch back and forth here.
Oh, is it? So it's something that you're not going to use unless you have to.
So the next item
Too much
is a
money.
letter, I think it's page 531, from the DNA subcommittee. And it basically is a recommendation from the subcommittee that any future presentation with regard to this type of technology needs to include, they call it a validation or enhanced performance check, you know, which I interpret to be at a minimum what the OCME did. You know, and I would suggest that we accept the recommendation with the clarification that it's our expectation that the vote we just took is limited to this particular organization with this particular instrument and to be used for the particular purpose we discussed. If any other organization wants to use this instrument or any other instrument for any purpose, it needs to go before the DNA subcommittee in this commission before it can be used. Any entity that would be under our control.
Mike, my only question is this. Let's say a police agency wants to use rapid DNA technology for crime scene purposes, and clearly that's coming. I think that that agency has to do far more in their presentation than simply showing that the technology works. They have to talk about training, crime scene sample consumption,
I absolutely agree
mixtures.
with you.
So how do
All
we
I'm
make
saying
that
is-
clear to the DNA subcommittee?
I think the only way we can really make it clear is if they send us a recommendation that doesn't do it, we send it back to them.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you, and I believe in the phrasing, I said minimum.
Okay.
Because depending on the use, you know, honestly, yeah, obviously would be open, you know, to listen to anything, but from what I know of the instrument, I would be hard pressed to understand right now in this technology how you can go out to a scene, you know, and be assured that you're going to have a clean, single profile sample.
Right.
So
Kentucky just started a big rapid DNA use of testing rape kits. So if you could have staff maybe check, I could check with some prosecutors in Kentucky, but I'd be curious as to what type of validation studies they've done there and how comfortable they are with the product.
Well, and are they using it again in the context of the laboratory that was doing the rape kit
Right.
analysis? Or are they using it? And that, we're gonna
You know,
get
are
back
they
to that lab
doing-
issue.
You know, are they using it for a swab
For
from the victim?
The exemplar
that's in,
swabs that
you know,
come
they-
with the
yeah.
kit or with the undies.
But I think all of those things, you know, that goes back to my point that it's really hard to, you can't decide these things, I don't think, until you have an application in front of you and you know the details of it. But I absolutely agree with you, Bill. And I think we should have no hesitation whatsoever if we get a recommendation from the subcommittee that doesn't meet our expectations, we send it back.
I would also ask though to consider if an agency decides to come in front of the DNA subcommittee, then there has to be some communication prior to that meeting about what there is a level of expectation. Because I don't think it's fair for the agency to come to the DNA subcommittee, get a binding agreement, come here and they get kicked back. Because then it just extends this process.
Yeah,
So again, I don't know if it has to be in writing, but I think at least if it's going to be on the agenda, there should be some communication back and forth.
Yeah, and I would say these are public meetings, and this is all posted and available. So any entity, that's contemplating using it, I would suggest to listen to the discussion that we just had, because I think, folks pretty clearly laid out, their concerns and expectations. But I agree with you, and if anyone contacts us, we'll certainly refer them to this discussion.
And they can't get to the DNA subcommittee without going through the office, so.
Yeah.
All right, a good point. So, I guess, do we need a formal vote to accept the next recommendation? So
I guess I would make the request again that the subcommittee flesh out what it considers an enhanced. And they could in writing just say what the LCME did, because to refer somebody to a tape, I just think it's fairly vague. I mean, I was looking at the tape, I had an appreciation for what they did, but I'm not the one who's going to try and duplicate it in a laboratory.
So do you want to send it back to them to ask them to clarify or provide some more detail in terms of what they mean by validation or enhanced performance check?
I think so. I mean, there are, dozens of organizations. I think there are going to be dozens of organizations that are going to try and figure that out. I think it's easier to have it in writing than sort of, check out our video. Like, I just think that they should set forth like what they're expecting that sort of presentation to be.
Yeah, and I agree with that, with the caveat that, I think they can indicate what the minimum bar is, but I think to some extent it may depend on usage, because, what I might expect for someone who wants to use it for this limited purpose would be very different than what I would expect if someone says, we want to take it out to the crime scene, and use it on whatever sample we might find at the crime scene.
And also the who is that's going to use it too.
Yeah, who's going to, no question.
Let me jump in on that. So obviously a lab would understand the distinctions between a performance check and an internal validation versus a non-lab. So I would certainly expect, if that's not too strong a word, that a non-lab who would like to use this technology would need to find out what the parameters are that they would have to meet for a performance check or an internal validation. And if they don't know that, then they would need to bring themselves up to speed if that's the verbiage that's in this letter.
No, absolutely. I think to David's point, I think there is value in sending it back, just because, one, it could be clarified, and two, I'm not quite sure we even need this, because, I think we've made clear what our thoughts are, and when a new application comes, they're going to decide it, but so if the DNA, if we send it back and they choose to flesh it out and provide more details, great. If they don't, then that's going to happen with the next case. But I see your point, and I think there are, there are some concerns with just adopting this as it's worded. So if you're making a motion that we send it back to them for clarification.
Yes, I am.
Could I add something, and not to belabor a point, but I think we have to be very careful with the language we keep using. So my understanding from this meeting was there is no internal validation study for rapid DNA, as per the FBI, because it's a closed system, etc., etc., etc. So I'm just saying, if we keep continuing using this back and forth with the language,
that's another reason to send it back.
Yeah, absolutely. I would just bring that point up,
Yeah.
that I would like that to be clarified from the DNA subcommittee. They might say, no, you're wrong. They're wrong. We want an internal validation. Then I understand that they've thought about it, but
There could be, if a lab developed its own methodology for rapid DNA testing, rather than purchasing a prepackaged
Yeah,
cell
but that,
contained.
I understand that, but that's
there
not.
could be.
But I
It
think
could
all
be, but
these-
that's not.
All of these things are reasons why we ought to send it back.
Okay.
But I think maybe, since many of the things that we've discussed were outside of the box, maybe we ask them to consider developing guidelines for implementation of rapid DNA testing so that they, could tell the individual entities that are proposing to do it, it's not just you buy this box and you show that you can do it, but you have to tell us, how are you going to collect the swabs? What swabs are you going to use? How are you going to train your people? If you have questionable results, who are you going to go to as an expert that can help you decipher or troubleshoot or, have a plan?
And again, I don't disagree, but I think, the answer to a lot of those questions also depends on who's coming. If it's a accredited lab that's coming in, the answers to those may be very different than if it's a police department that has no lab associated.
Right, and I'm not saying they should tell them what to say. I'm just saying these are some of the things you should address.
Right.
Be prepared to address when you come forward.
So we have a motion. Do we have a second? I'll second it. Everyone in favor of sending this back to the DNA subcommittee for clarification?
The enhanced performance check versus.
Just the
whole
terminology.
thing, yeah.
We're not undoing what we did before.
No.
Okay.
No, this is a separate issue. All right. And anyone opposed? Any abstention? All right, so that carries. All right, next, we have a lot of new business today. Genetic genealogy was discussed, and I know we've talked about it briefly. It was discussed at the DNA subcommittee. John, I did ask Ann if she would give us just a brief update in terms of the status of the application or applications that are pending at the Department of Health, and entertain any questions that the commission might have.
Right, so the laboratories that propose to do genetic genealogy for the purposes of forensics and ultimately identification of the person who's the source of the DNA fall under our jurisdiction. So the way we are approaching it is that there's two entities. There's the wet lab that actually processes the DNA and comes up with a DNA profile, and then there's the bioinformatics lab that has to have criteria for quality of the data that they'll accept, and then they will run it through whatever database they seem to have access to and seems best, like a best fit for them, and then come up with their list of individuals that might provide a investigative lead. So in thinking about it, that the typical partner labs that they're looking at are not necessarily forensics labs. I'm talking about the wet lab here. So this is a public knowledge. So we do have an application from Parabon, and they are actively working on meeting our requirements for submission of documentation. The lab that they work with the most is Akesogen, which is more of a clinical lab. They do cancer genetic testing. They use this massive SNP panel of 850,000 SNPs. And being a cancer lab, they would have some experience with mixtures because often the tissue that's submitted is a mixture of normal cells from that person mixed in with the cancer cells. So there are genetic differences in there. We don't feel it's really, considering that what the lab would be doing is just this SNP panel, we don't feel that it is fair to require them to necessarily be a forensic identity laboratory, as long as they can address all of the things of concern, like sample identity, tracking the sample, no sample mix-ups, no contamination, and then having a clear documentation of what they do and report to Parabon. But that requires that they will receive extracted DNA. So the expectation is that the samples that will be submitted are samples that are coming from a forensics lab where the STR testing has been done. There's no hit, but it's a cold case. It's a serious case, and there's enough DNA to submit for this. And so this additional testing will be done, and it'll be submitted as a quantitative DNA extract. And Parabon does have a consulting component to their services where they'll work with the investigators and discuss, the quantity of DNA that they have and the quality of the DNA and whether it's really old, whether there's an opportunity for re-extraction to provide fresher DNA, et cetera. So if we consider that the extract is a work product, then we feel comfortable saying that that wet lab doesn't have to be a forensics lab with respect to having a forensic identity permit from the Department of Health, but they do have to have a permit in a applicable category. So they could apply for our oncology-molecular genetics permit. And so their lab would have to have a proper lab director, their staff would be looked at, all of their methods and validations would be looked at, their quality system would be looked at, and they'd be inspected. They would be expected to do proficiency testing, and they would continue to have this review, at least an on-site audit every 2 years. So that's how we, ensure the quality of the wet lab. And then Parabon is going forward and submitting their protocols and their validation using various different DNAs and different agencies that they have worked with. And once we're satisfied that so they have a lab director with forensic criteria, is Mark Wilson. He was at the FBI. And they're putting all of their policies and procedures in place and making sure that all of their staff members are trained and have been competency tested and so forth. And once we get to a certain point where we're fairly sure they're ready for an inspection, we'll go on site and inspect them. I can't give you any sort of a time frame as to when they might be approved, but again, they need to be approved, but also the wet lab that they're going to use needs also to be approved, so that 2 permits have to be issued. So in terms of oversight, they'll have active oversight. We will give Parabon, assuming that everything goes smoothly, a permit in forensic identity that's limited to this investigative genetic genealogy and phenotyping and kinship analyses. And we will hold them to all of the New York State and FBI standards that we see as applicable. But obviously many of them are not going to be directly applicable. So I hope that provides some, confidence that, the process will go forward. And again, this is an investigative lead, and the expectation is that they're, if it is successful and it identifies the original perpetrator, there'll be DNA obtained from that person, if they're not deceased, I suppose. And then that direct comparison between that person and the crime scene DNA could be done in a traditional accredited forensic lab using just the traditional STR approach, and then that would be the solid piece of evidence that would go to trial.
The same if it pointed to a family, indicated it was a family member, there would by definition have to be some type of confirmatory testing.
Well, not the family member. So the way I understand it is that
person of interest.
Parabon would give the investigators a list of their top 5 hits. And one of them. I should
have been more precise, but like the Wisconsin case was just in the news. As I understand it, it pointed to, I think, 3 or 4 family members, and they went through and I think they'd eliminated 2, and on the 3rd one they got a sample off of an envelope that someone had sealed, did an independent test with that sample against the forensic sample. So it wasn't the Parabon analysis, ultimately it was that second test they did with
which
the
is
direct comparison.
Yeah.
Anyone have questions? And thank you for the update. I appreciate it.
And is Parabon the company that will literally send you a composite drawing of what they believe the suspect looks like?
Yeah, they do phenotype analysis, which is hair color, eye color, skin dark lightness. They also do like a face shape sort of prediction, and they have I think that's all. Oh, whether or not they have freckles, whether or not they have red hair.
And in addition to that, they can also search public genealogy websites and say the perpetrator's got a cousin named.
Yeah, they claim that they have data that will allow them to find somebody that's out as far as 6 degrees separation.
Okay. And even though you can't give us a time frame, do you have a judgment? I mean, is this moving expeditiously? Or?
It's moving expeditiously, but there is a fair amount of work that goes with it. But I did check before I came, and we haven't seen any documentation from the wet lab. So whether or not that will be a holdup,
I haven't heard that expression before. The wet lab.
So
that's not a public forensic crime laboratory. That's a separate lab that will do some type of enhanced. They have to get the sample from the police agency or a lab in New York State.
So whoever holds the evidence would find a forensic lab that can produce the DNA extract. And presumably they've already done traditional methods and they're not working. And then they move on to this. So they call Parabon. So this is the scenario. They call Parabon. They describe the case. Parabon says, we think we can help you. You have enough DNA. So you should fill out this form and submit that extract to Akesogen. And then Akesogen is the wet lab, meaning that they're the ones that start with a DNA extract and produce a DNA profile. And then that raw data gets transmitted to Parabon for analysis of the DNA.
And when you say DNA profile, it's not a traditional 24 loci.
No, it's SNPs. So there's 850 SNP calls.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
I think wet lab is just being used to distinguish the genealogy work that Parabon is doing from the identification of the profile that's being done from the extract.
Correct. Yeah.
And so the SNPs, they're actually coding DNA, right?
Not necessarily.
They're non-coding DNA?
They could be either.
And is there any regulation as to what these companies use, just in terms of
No, basically it is a very so the SNPs are spread across all of the chromosomes, and there's good representation of each area of the chromosome.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really comprehensive, very informative way to look at a DNA profile that's, I think, probably just orders of magnitude greater than STR analysis, honestly, in terms of individualizing the specimen.
So, I guess the concern is from traditional STR, even if you're doing familial search and you go it's fairly linear, you're going to get a fairly close relative. And if you're talking about, sixth cousin, there are a lot of people that are going to be connected to that sixth, because it's not going to be a linear sort of whatever. There are going to be a lot of people in society that are six cousins away.
Can never solve a case in Kentucky, I'll tell you
or Maine's.
No offense to Kentucky.
No, I just don't. I'm sure they didn't take any. In terms of in your town.
I could just as easily have said Onondaga County.
Yeah, Tompkins County.
And the police agency can't submit the sample on their own. They have to go through, it has to come from an accredited lab in this stage.
So the way, if you were to go on our website, it's a little bit unclear. So if anybody has any questions, they should just call. But the way the law is set up and the regulations are set up is the DNA has to be submitted by somebody who's approved to submit it as a function of their official, professional activity. So, for example, in the past we've said private investigators cannot submit for this,
Sure.
and family members can't try and solve a crime on their own by submitting, so forth.
I mean, I guess the privacy concerns that, sort of, in terms of like the, that's not sort of where you go where the case is solved, but the vast majority out there where, like, if you're doing 6 generations away and then you show up at someone's, doorstep, it just seems like it seems like a low probative value where you're collected in some sort of vast database.
So actually, something has changed in the last, I think, 2 weeks. I can't remember the date exactly. Late May, because of pressure put on GEDmatch, which is the population database that they've been using. They switched from, they used to have their user agreement was an opt-out. Like, so you would read it. If you didn't want to have your profile available for search by law enforcement, you would opt out. And they had some objections to the use of the database by some of its users. And because there was one case, I guess, in Utah where it was like a 79-year-old woman organist who got strangled and left for dead in a church. So she wasn't, so it wasn't a murder. It wasn't a rape. And no, I don't know. So anyways, it was actually obviously a violent crime. She was left for dead. She was afraid this person was going to come back. So GEDmatch agreed to let law enforcement search. And some criticized them as not conforming to their own user agreement policy. So because of that, a couple weeks ago, they took everybody and opted them out of searches by law enforcement. And now that when you log on, there's a indicator that says you have to opt in if you want your profile searchable by law enforcement. And there's some verbiage encouraging people to opt in, saying, if this is how we work for a better society, and the more people that opt in, the more powerful this tool is for law enforcement. But that does kind of get to the privacy issue. Like, you have to actively click in 2 spots to opt in now. So I think that might lessen some of your concerns there.
The other thing I just note is that, this isn't, Ann is kind enough to give us an update on what Department of Health is doing. We don't have jurisdiction over this given our statute.
Right.
So certainly if the Department of Health ever gets to a spot where they feel the commission could be helpful, let us know and we'd be happy to help. But, at this point, I understand your concerns. I think they're legitimate concerns to express, but we don't have an issue in front of us to, we don't have the power to say do it or don't do it as a commission right now. The New York State lab came on board and said we want to do SNPs testing in this context. Then we will. But certainly appreciate the update. Ann?
I just had a question. I mean, this is comparable to the familial searching that we're now authorizing through our forensic databases, although it's using SNPs, which is much more information than STRs. We set up through the commission the familial search system where we're asking the investigators to tell us exactly why do they want to do this, and we're incorporating the training component on the other end. If we approve the reason for the search and the justification for the search and the memorandum, these entities, which might well be a New York State forensics lab, not going through the DCHAS familial search, they might be doing that concurrently, right? Decide that they also want to pursue this commercial option, because it is a commercial option. That one of the things that DOH and DCJS might consider would be some way to incorporate at least the elements of the training program in suggesting to Parabon that when they're doing all this great communication back to the requester, right, they get some hits and they're going to share the information and they're providing all this support effort, that it might be worthwhile offering to that requester the elements of the training program. This is what it's going to take. I don't know that DOH could impose a requirement on Parabon that they incorporate the training program for the requester in the approval, but it's something that might be considered, because I think we will potentially encounter the New York State Forensics Lab or investigator making the request for familial search through the DCJS system at the same time that they say, I got lots of DNA left. I'm not going to wait for that process if and when this gets approved. I'm going to contact Parabon, and I'm going to ask them if I have enough DNA, can I send it to this cancer testing lab to get the SNPs done that I don't have the capacity to do, to get another set of data working through a totally different data analysis system. It may find the same families, but our family database is really small. It's convicted felons or convicted offenders. That's the database we're searching.
Yeah, there's also a tighter connection between who would be identified through familial searching than through
tighter kinship connection, yes.
Connection.
But much broader data profiles that I'm searching through Parabon, right? I'm searching all relatives in these genealogical databases from Ancestry.com to, I don't even know all the databases they're using these days, right? All on SNPs, all of, a huge profile of DNA elements, hundreds of thousands, not 15s, right? So we're once they're approved in New York, we can anticipate investigators, I think, doing a parallel search. And it's just a thought that having gone to all the trouble of developing this training program, sharing that at least with Parabon when they're approved, it's just another resource for them in many respects.
DCJS, as I see it, doesn't have a formal role. We don't have any authority to insert ourselves, but we've indicated to DOH, that if we can be helpful in any way, feel free to let us know, and we'll, help in any way that we can.
Right, and our authority is also limited really to what our jurisdiction of the lab is, and so we can't dictate to law enforcement officers like what types of tests or what types of crimes should qualify or anything like that. So there isn't a mechanism, I don't think, to set up something like we have for familial DNA.
So if I could ask, first of all, thank you for the update, and if we could just keep this as a standing item for now, and at our next meeting, just provide us with any updates. All right, next we have lab disclosures. This is the last list of items we have on our agenda. The first relates to the Monroe County Crime Laboratory. There's an email chain from May 15th of this year, and it's an initial notification as I read it, an acknowledgement of a non-conformance with regard to an incorrect serial number. As I read it, the evidence was resubmitted, reanalyzed, and amended with court position. I believe from my reading that we did get a follow-up with future meetings in terms of how this is resolved. I don't know, any questions on this? Next, we have the New York City Police Department Police Laboratory. There's, I believe, four submissions here. I don't know, Scott, do you want to take us through these? And, the first, I think, is incorrect drug.
Yeah. So the first one's page 538. So I came to the commission maybe a couple months ago with a similar incident. We're looking into implementing some type of, I can't remember the term right now, possible witnessing or... Jen, why don't you join the table? What you got, verbal check, like a pilot does. You know, just
The issue here is it went out as was it cocaine and it was heroin and
yes,
vice versa.
yeah. All the anecdotal data supported it. It was on the lab report, the wrong drop down, and it was not caught upon review. It just, again, this is not an excuse. We do 35,000 cases a year in the drug section. This shouldn't be happening, so that's why we're trying to implement this concept of a verbal check now. We have checklists, we have other people who are taking off
So
casework.
what would the verbal check be?
It would be, Mike, cocaine? Cocaine, Mike,
So
right?
the reviewer-
Yeah, the reviewer's like, cocaine, right? So, I mean, that's what we're getting to because you had,
Oh my God.
you know, Jen, if you want to...
The idea was to sort of put those major points on the verbal checklist that would really be the most detrimental to our customer. So the identification of any items, the weight of any items, that type of thing. And the idea being that one person would be holding the laboratory report and somebody else would be holding the laboratory notes, and they would be comparing between them. So one person would say, item number one's cocaine. Here it says heroin. And hopefully catch that before then the report goes out with that typo.
So this is a notification of the incident. We're working through it. So you've all got an update
So
on
you'll
this.
come back to
Yeah,
us.
we'll come back on this one.
Okay. Any questions on that one?
Are you talking about for every single case doing this verbal check?
Well,
And-
yes,
that's
because
what we're
we've
thinking
been here
about.
twice in 1 year, and this has happened
I see.
prior years.
Okay.
So we keep trying to solve this problem, and it's going to keep coming. So we need
Yeah,
to try other
okay.
ways to solve it. So.
They should know each other a little better.
Oh, they know each other well.
Cocaine.
And then with the second one, this one is something you've been here before on, right?
Correct, yes. It was about paperwork that was exchanged in the firearms analysis section.
Right.
So this was an update and a closeout of that particular incident. I don't know if anyone has any questions on that one.
No?
Next one. Again, it was another closeout. If you remember, we discussed images about.
Yes. This was the missing images.
Not missing images, missing
Metadata.
audit log information
Yes.
for 1% of the images, which, you know, it's detailed in the communication. It's mostly IT issues and also communication between IT and also the analysts doing the cases as they're upgrading software and changing factors. They were reset. So we've put steps in place to minimize that happening again.
All right. And then, any questions on that one? And the last one is an initial notification, I believe, is that correct?
Yes, I believe so.
And that's, has to do with caffeine?
Yes. I'm going to let Jen explain this one a little bit more because I was a drug chemist, but not been a good one for a long, long time.
Was this in a supplemental? This was in a
This one is
Yeah.
supplemental,
Okay.
correct? It was in supplemental.
I think it's
I-
590 to 593 of the supplemental.
We didn't think 3 was enough.
June
Thought we'd send
7th.
another one.
June 7th. The June 7th one.
Want attention, I get it.
You
Can you
got
just give us a brief?
Sure. We had in late December 3 cases that came in around the same time, within a day or two of each other. It was a solid material powder sample. And after analysis, it was determined that among other controlled substances, there was caffeine in it, which was struck us as slightly unusual at the time. Caffeine is normally found in a plant. We've only ever seen it in plant material. We've never seen it in a powder format. We'd done a little bit of sort of online research to see if it had been seen anywhere. We couldn't find any reference except for some found in Israel. But the mass spectral data was spot on. to the caffeine standard, and the retention time met our retention time criteria for our gas chromatography. So we went ahead and we identified caffeine in 3 of those reports. Very soon after that, a day or two, we got more samples with the same thing, but we started seeing a wider shift in the retention time. Still within our laboratory's criteria of a 0.1 minute within the standard, but it was further away from what we would normally see. It was really on the outside of that 0.1. And so we held off on making any additional identifications and started doing a little bit more research. We found out that caffeine has 3 other stereoisomers. We had the standard for 1 of those stereoisomers, which we ran against the standard in some of the samples. They all looked exactly the same. So we ordered 1 more, a racemic mixture of the other 2 stereoisomers because neither one we could find individually. We could only find a standard for the racemic mixture. So after we got that in, we were able to run the samples against that, and it seemed to be spot on. At the same time, however, we don't at this time still know if it was one or the other compound or if it was the racemic mixture, because we would expect to get the exact same results via GCMS. We're not set up to run polarimetry because all of these samples are mixed with fentanyl and heroin, and some of them are also mixed with cocaine or tramadol or 6-monoacetylmorphine, and these are all optically active compounds, so we wouldn't be able to run polarimetry to determine the optical activity. And if we tried to run it on FTIR, we have too many interfering substances to get any good data on that too. So we do have a chiral column, which will help determine different optical isomers of the same compound, but we've never used one before, so we would have to undergo some sort of method validation for that.
Yeah, so I thought it made sense. So I think the main thing was that we had a compound that was that we identified based upon our current criteria, but there was an optical isomer, which simply means the molecules are arranged differently in spatial orientation, and that was not captured in the difference between what we identified. So we found that out, and we amended our reports to not identify caffeine. As Jennifer said, there was fentanyl, cocaine, and other controlled substances, but we're now working on a validation, so if we have that particular substance again, and it's probably going to be because it was in powder form. That was our first alert, and we did not consider these optical isomers. And the way the law is written, sometimes the law, like cocaine, all optical isomers are controlled, but other times the law is written in a certain way that maybe not. This is controlled. So,
although New York State law does list under caffeine, it says caffeine and its isomers. Right. So we do think that there's a very good possibility that all of these isomers are included in the same schedule. And we did reach out to the executive DA of our special narcotics section, and he agreed that he thought that it would be the same. But we can't really make a determination ourselves of the legality of it.
All right. Any questions? All right, thank you. Next item is from the, actually 2 items. Sorry. Right. Do we have the acting lab director, Charlie Clark, with us in Albany?
This is just something, right?
Good morning, Charlie.
I don't think he can hear you.
Can you hear me? Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, maybe you can just speak up a little bit louder.
Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, we had 2 cases. One case was an older case from 2015. There was a misidentification. When the examiners and the analysts have time, they will relaunch old cases. And so an examiner this year launched one of the old cases from 2015. In the original case, the examiner launched or searched on the state database. There was a non-identification there. Also searched the FBI database on our FBI dedicated workstation. and determined there was no identification there. When the case was relaunched, the second analyst, again, there was no identification in the state search, but they did make an identification on the FBI search. When compared with the candidate list from the original analyst, that candidate was present, so it was a misidentification. So we did send out an amended report for that case, for the misidentification.
All right, now you're looking into, you're doing a root cause analysis, looking into what happened and why?
We are, and we're also reviewing cases by that analyst. At the time, in 2015, we would search, FBI searches were done, but there was no verification step we had at that time. The FBI ULW workstation didn't allow for that. SABIS, when we search on SABIS, we search state searches, we have a second verification process, so a second examiner looks at all those same candidates and does the same process. In 2017, we had a tech refresh, our first tech refresh for SABIS, upgraded SABIS so that we can actually search FBI now through SABIS, which allows us to do that secondary search or that second verification. So we do have a second person looking at all those same searches, those same candidates. We are going to implement a procedure if anyone uses the old standalone workstation for FBI, the FBI dedicated workstation, we will have a verification process for those prints as well. However, we very rarely use that the older FBI dedicated workstation. So we will be implementing that procedure if somebody does search that, and we will be reviewing cases from 2015 to 2017 for that examiner, just to make sure that there were no other misses for those FBI searches.
In the 2015 timeframe, that was before the lab was an accredited laboratory, is that correct?
That is correct.
All right, thank you. And then this, Pat, you
I've got one question. I've missed it. It's Pat Buffalino from NASA. Well, I shouldn't say where I'm from. It's Pat Buffalino. So well, that went over pretty well. So in 2015, did the person confirming also miss it, or there just wasn't a confirmation process?
There wasn't a confirmation process at that time for the FBI searches. We did have one for the state searches, but for our FBI searches at that time, because the software was not the same, we were not doing a secondary, or we weren't doing a verification process on the FBI non-idents. If it was an identification, we of course had multiple people look at that with tech review and admin review. But the non-idents for the FBI searches at that time, we were not doing a confirmation step.
Okay, but you did say that is going to happen now.
That is happening now. Like I said, we search them now through SABIS, which actually allows for that verification process, and we are going to implement a procedure if the old ULW's FBI dedicated workstation is used, we will have a verification process for that as well.
Thank you.
and then the second one, Charlie?
The second one was a larger case. There were 17 latents that were deemed sufficient for comparison. We had a number of identifications to two different individuals. The issue with this was that there was some information was left out of the report. We did mention all of the. There were 8 identifications, 1 inconclusive, and 8 non-identifications. What happened was the non-identifications were mentioned in the narrative by saying all unsolved latents would be entered into the unsolved latent database and continue to be searched. However, they were not listed as we had 8 non-identifications. The inconclusive, however, was not listed, and that should have been in the report. So when our quality manager case was from last year. This year, the quality manager was reviewing cases and came across this case, and so the case was relaunched. Originally, what happened with the 2 individuals that were identified to, neither had latent eligible events in their history. So we could only send out a report that basically said we made identifications and had to send out letters as to why we could not release the histories for those 2 individuals. This year, when the case was reviewed and that was the report was found to be missing information, the latents were run again just to make sure there was no other problems with that. And the 2 individuals actually now had open events which could be identified too. One of the one inconclusive print, because of the new event, had better fingerprint images as the exemplars. We were able to make that identification as well to the individual. So now So when the new report went out, we had to make all the identifications, but then we released the history for each of the 2 individuals, but also included, it was no longer an inconclusive, it was now identification, and then we also listed the 8 non-identifications, which were still determined to be non-identifications. So all of that was included in the second amended report.
Are you doing a review of the casework of the analysts and reviewers that were involved as part of the corrective action?
That is correct. We're doing cases for actually all the people, for the analyst, for the tech reviewer, and the admin reviewer. We're going and sampling their cases as well to make sure that this didn't happen on in previous occasions.
All right, and on both of these, will we be hearing back from you?
Yes.
Any questions? Thank you. The last set of items we have is the Suffolk County Crime Laboratory. There's an email chain dated April 2nd of this year, and then a closeout from May 23rd of this year. As I read it, pertains to a sample switch incident. I don't know, who do we have from Suffolk? Before I get something wrong with it. Memorize this.
Sure thing. Good morning. My name is Connie Dinkle. I'm the quality manager for Suffolk County. We had an incident in the DNA section where the tubes were being placed, the amplification tubes were being placed into a tray for electrophoresis. And I actually brought one with you so you could see this. For those of you not familiar, these are the tubes. Can you even see it? So we write in marker. We identify the run in marker and also on the cap. We had an 8 and a 9 for run 8, run 9, and the 8 had an overwrite on it, so it looked like a 9. So when it was being plated for electrophoresis, they got flip-flopped. We do a QA review of our samples, which is how this got caught, because the QA review identified 2 separate cases that had the same profile. The problem was that the QA review was done after the report was already released. So that's why we elevated it to a level 1. So now we've instituted that the tubes will be witnessed prior to electrophoresis by a second analyst, and we're also doing a mandatory QA review before the reports are released. Okay.
Any questions?
Do you guys have a replicative process that may have caught it prior to going out?
I don't know what that is. Just explain that to me really quick.
So essentially just repeating inclusions or exclusions just to assure that you don't have a sample switch up of the known or the unknown.
I'm not familiar with that term, so I'm going to say no, but I could be wrong. So I can call the DNA supervisor if you want clarification on that.
No.
I don't speak DNA very well, so I'm afraid
Neither do I. Don't worry about that.
So I can keep it to the corrective action paperwork, but I don't know. We'll have to phone a friend.
Good, and then any other questions on that issue?
Do you limit the sample name that's written? Because sometimes when you're trying to write so much on those little tubes, that could be the problem.
On the side, they write more information. On the cap itself, it's just the number of the spot.
Right.
So
Okay.
because it was
Generally-
the overwrite, it was unclear,
Got
and
it.
it looked like a 9.
So it would
Side,
just,
though, with heat, doesn't that?
if it's up above, well, that's more for the thermocycler part
Oh,
of it?
these are just 3,500.
Yeah, these are the electric.
Post amp.
This post
They've
amp.
never been in the thermocycle.
I don't think so. No.
And then the second one, if I'm reading it right, is a closeout regarding an issue involving contamination of the reagent blank. If I'm reading this right, it looks like you determined it may have been due to a break in an analyst's glove.
Yeah.
And you've instituted some procedures, and maybe you can just tell us what they're.
Yeah, so what they've instituted now is disposable lab coats. They have to tape at the wrist. They have to double check their gloves to make sure that there's obviously no obstruction to the glove material. They evaluated. There's a standard for contamination. I guess that SWGDAM put out, so they reevaluated that. I think that's about it.
Looks like you also hit a monitoring phase, and there were no other instances of contamination.
That's correct. No, so after they implemented all these changes, they haven't seen any additional indications of contamination by an analyst.
All right, any questions?
Just how was the error caught initially? I don't think I heard.
I'm sorry?
How was the
error
error?
caught initially?
We have that QA review. So we had, it's a batch run, and there are multiple cases in the run. And when the analyst's DNA showed up in the QA review, they knew that they had a contamination issue in the reagent blank. Plus, there should not be a DNA
negative.
profile in a reagent blank. Yeah.
Was it a reagent blank that should have come up negative and instead
Correct.
it came up with something in it?
Yes, it came up with the analyst's DNA in it.
And it just could be the wording of it, but it said the analyst initially didn't know, then upon further question indicating the analyst noticed that, a break in the glove.
Right.
But you didn't have it. But the issue isn't something about being forthcoming or not forthcoming.
No, but the problem is she wouldn't have known that she made the contamination until after the fact. And then she realized, oh, you know what? I did have a break in my glove that may have been the problem. We're also using cap openers now as well, so they won't actively be touching the caps. That was something I left out.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
That's everything. We do not have any items for executive session unless anyone else has anything.
Go ahead, Bill.
I'm sorry. I don't want to take up a lot of time, but for the non-lawyers in the room, there are new discovery statutes that go into effect January 1st, and I'm not here to discuss the efficacy or the lunacy of the new statutes. We live in a democracy. Those are the rules. We'll live by it. But some of those rules directly affect the lab directors in this room and the rest of the lab directors in the state. There's no money provided for the labs. My lab director, who I think is a very sober, cogent individual, has indicated she has to have more personnel to deal with the collating and the data and so forth, and I suspect that the lab directors in this room would agree with her. But more problematic is an interpretation by many, including some of my colleagues, that these new discovery statutes require the mandatory testing of all drugs that come into a lab, regardless of whether or not defense counsel and defendant want to make a knowing plea before that takes place. Now, I don't know if that's correct. That may be decided by some judge, but why don't we correct that now so that that is clear in the statute, that is not mandatory for all labs to go, because my colleague to my left here, I believe, has maybe 35,000 drug cases.
That's the ones we do
already.
already.
That's the ones you do
There's
already.
another 80,000
that you don't do. Yeah. My lab director tells me they test about 10% of the drugs that come into the lab. The other 90% of the cases, as I'm sure Ben and David will tell you, that in most drug cases the issue is the propriety of the stop. If a defense lawyer comes to me and says, look, you got my guy, but it's not fentanyl, it's talcum powder, we'll test the drugs. That's just common sense. But to mandate that every lab, with no new funding, test every drug that comes into the lab, you might as well just close all labs down.
Bill, I hate to stop you. Could
Yeah.
you point the language out? Because I've read it, and I don't know the language you're referring to that mandates that.
I'm going by a memo, Mike, that I don't have with me from Jed Painter. I can send that memo to you.
Because I know, I don't dispute that that the new statute puts additional obligations on labs in terms of discovery, both in terms of the scope of what needs to be turned over and the timing. But I'm not aware, as I read it, the discovery is of things that exist. I haven't read it to impose obligations to create things that don't exist. So if there's language in there that you're pointing to, I'd love to see it.
I will point that out to you. Some of my, again, it's not unanimity in opinion, but if people who have been prosecutors for 25 years believe that the interpretation of the statute is such.
How long I've been a prosecutor?
Me? 40. I started when I was 12. All right, so let me move on to the second thing, which is also problematic, is the mandatory key searches. That is, there's a crime scene sample. It is developed, a partial profile or a full profile, whatever is developed, and defense counsel, reasonably so, says, well, that belongs to the real perpetrator, not my client. I want to test it. The problem is that some of those key searches may violate ANAB rules and may violate CODIS rules and regulations. So the only thing I would suggest is a chapter amendment so that any mandated key search can only be mandated in instances where it doesn't violate existing rules. You can't supersede ANAB and you can't supersede the CODIS regulations. Otherwise, a lab could lose their ability to access CODIS. And the second two things, very, very quickly, are policy matters. I think this group should send a letter to the governor, the Speaker of the Assembly, and the President of the Senate asking or suggesting more funding for our labs to fulfill their obligations under these new statutes. And the second policy thing is that there's currently a bill pending which is gaining some traction that would eliminate all local DNA data banks, just eliminate them. And Connie just gave us an example of the need for a local DNA data bank or a database, a contamination elimination. That would be illegal under this bill, and I would suggest that we as a group send a letter again to the legislature saying this is a bad idea. There's a First Department case that just came down that indicated that local DNA databases are subject to the executive law. So some of the concerns that the people have in proposing this legislation would not come about. I don't know that it's not everything that I have concerns with, but I think that's everything that this group should be very, very concerned about.
Yes, I hear everything you're saying. I understand where you're coming from. My concern is, a lot of us around the table have different constituencies, and if you were saying the DA's Association should weigh in and make their position known, or the lab director should weigh in and make their position known, or the defense bar. But I am concerned with the commission, moving out of our role of oversight of labs and moving into, more political arena in terms of taking positions on these things. It seems to me that the various associations and organizations that many people around this table belong to certainly have advocated in the past and have the ability to advocate for these things. To me, that might be the more proper venue to do it rather than pulling the commission into it.
We historically have weighed in on quote-unquote political matters, and I'm not suggesting that this group take a vote and say this whole discovery, bail reform, speedy trial are bad laws and you should repeal all of them immediately. I'm only talking about things that are impossible to implement. If Jet Painter is right that nobody can enter a plea in the state of New York after January 1st until all lab work has been completed, then that is going to directly impact the crime laboratories in New York State with an impossible burden. It's not possible to do that. And the same with key searches. Again, that's just a poorly drafted statute. It is not a political matter when you're telling a lab director you have to violate ANAB standards and you have to violate the CODIS regulations because a court has ordered you to do so. That's not political. That's just say, hey guys, wake up. You got to correct this before it goes into place.
So if you're asking us to vote on it, as to the first one, I don't know how I could possibly vote on whether or not we should take action without seeing the language.
I agree with you, and I could, I hate to put it off till September, but again, different interpretation. It's going to be decided by some judge in February or March of next year. And if the judge says, the way I read that statute is you got to test all 500 packets of fentanyl before the guy can plead guilty, then we got a problem, folks.
Yep. In the same vein that Bill's talking about, there are, I think ABFT has requirements of databases for labs to maintain on who's testified, the qualifications of who's testified. It's not as robust as the new legislation requirements of 10 years of proficiency testing for each expert witness. But there may be something that the labs can do to make this available to the prosecutor's office. Maybe it's downloadable for each of their scientists who testifies so they can turn it over to the defense, because I can see that as being, that's another statutory requirement, and the raw data, turning over raw data. Clearly, there needs to be some funding behind some of these if there's going to be compliance. So while we may be looking at it through a different lens, I think there's issues that the labs are going to need to address if they're going to meet the requirements of the statute come January. Maybe we make it an agenda item for September and devote a little bit more time to it. But I think that we're headed for significant problems come January 1st when all of this kicks in. If there is portals created so that the lab shouldn't be available to the whole world, but if it's my case, I want to know what that expert's history is, and the prosecutor's office has to have a way to access it from the lab. And the bigger the lab, the more of a uphill climb it's going to be. And to continue to update it on proficiency test resulting over the last 10 years for each scientist. I had one case, I couldn't get them to identify the initials of the scientist who was on the paperwork. So it's going to be a sea change.
No, I don't disagree with the substance of what you're saying, but if lab directors need funding or DAs need funding, I don't know that the commission, at least this is just my personal view, I don't know the commission is the vehicle through which we should be representing different constituencies looking for funding.
I mean, we just told Nassau County they better provide an adequate lab.
But we didn't write a letter to the state legislature saying you need to give Nassau County money.
We did.
No, we wrote to the people who deal with the money. So I mean, I don't mind Ben's suggestion that we make it an agenda item in September, and I can certainly email people with the language that Jed Painter is talking about before then.
Why don't we do that then? Why don't we put it on in September, and if you can provide some detailed information so that we can flesh this out a little more in terms of specific actions you're asking for.
I think, I understand what you're saying, and I think it's important to understand the oversight the Commission has. And I think it's just also important to understand what the lab directors are now going to go through. So I think that's the part of the understanding from the Commission. This law is in effect as of January 1st. We're going to be moving to compliance because we have to. And there's going to be things that are going to fall by the wayside. You may see more non-conformances. Right. You may see more assessments where there's problems. I think that's definitely something just to recognise that the labs and the system is going through a change, which is going to require a lot of resources either redirected or getting from your own agency. But I think all the lab directors are fully aware of this and are working hopefully with each of their own prosecutor's office to come up with the appropriate plan of what we can test, what we can't test, what we're going to, So I think the main thing is to understand from the Commission at least that if you see, as you mentioned earlier, and I always say it, you mentioned there was 12 non-conformances. Right. A number does not always reflect the quality of an organisation. So I just want we're going to be directing a lot of resources that we're doing X, Y, Z to do A, B, C now. So you're going to see changes, but I think those changes have to be from the lab and the customer base, which is the prosecutor's office. And each lab director is at different stages. Portals and IT solutions, all of these things are very much outside the scope of the lab director, but has to work with the other parts of their own agencies. So there is not a one answer to this. It's going to be very complicated, and I think we all know that. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that we're going to figure out an agreement, that in terms of interpreting the statute. And I think the danger of, sending a letter to the legislator saying the statute says X and us taking a position on what the statute says is that it may or may not change. And that this is part of, sort of litigation in terms of like the Commission, believes this or that about what the statute requires. I just don't know that that's our function. I think our function is to figure out,
the science and what the duty of the labs are to the respective parties. That I don't know that we should be
But educating ourselves as to what
educating
that is.
That's a
important.
separate thing.
No, I agree. In other contexts, we've tried very hard, in spite of people's attempts to bring us into litigation of particular cases, to stay out of that realm. And I think we should continue to do that. But I think the best thing to do. I don't think we can make any decisions with what we have in front of us right now. So if I hear what all of you are saying. I don't disagree. This puts a burden on laboratories. It puts a burden on prosecutors' offices. If there are specific steps that someone wants the commission to take as a result of this, we'll put it on the agenda for our next meeting. And I just ask that you provide us with information and flesh out specific asks ahead of time so that we can come prepared to look at them and make decisions on them.
Well, regarding whether or not it's mandatory that all drugs be tested, but certainly it's specific about the statute regarding LDIS databases and
But
the
that hasn't.
key searches.
Yeah, nothing's passed, so I guess, you're asking the commission to weigh in on pending legislation.
Well, we could put that pending legislation on just for educational reasons.
Yeah, but I guess to me, that's a basic, if the DA's Association, for example, feels that pending legislation is, inappropriate, flies in the face of accepted practice, whatever it might be,
yeah.
There's a vehicle to weigh in. If the lab directors feel it's that way, there's a vehicle to weigh in. Is it the commission's role to weigh in on bills, that haven't been passed and, tell the legislature, hey, this is how we feel about your bills that are.
I've limited my comments, Mike, to pieces of legislation that I think are directly impossible for labs to maintain. We're not going to regulate labs that can't function, and I haven't talked about proficiency testing. Now, Pat, Scott, and the others have to get all the proficiency testing of the guy together. Mr. Analyst, didn't you get a C in high school chemistry? Isn't it a fact that you took a proficiency exam back in 2004 and you flunked? I mean, it's just.
Now, I hear what
I'm not talking about that.
It's a
I'm not
slippery
talking
road
about
to
that.
get on. And then David comes to us and says, there's several bills pending in the legislature that the Defenders Association has concerns with as to, and we want the commission to weigh in on those bills.
And if they adversely impact labs, I'll join them in commenting.
I just think it's a slippery slope
Mike,
on weighing in this area.
I do think that we should send a letter out to all the labs advising them that all of their chemists and scientists at this point need to keep track of what is going to be necessary under the statute, because we do oversee them, and so I do think we should at least give them the heads up that says you need to keep track of.
If you want to draft something that you think fairly interprets this bill, and provides
I'm just referring to section F where it says that proficiency tests for the past 10 years.
If you want me to send the statute as it exists, because they can't find the statute somewhere, I'll mail it to them. If you want me to write a memo interpreting the statute,
I don't want you to write a memo interpreting the statute, but I do think we should make sure all of the labs under our control know that their scientists are going to have to provide that information, and so that they have some leeway for this. Because I don't know if I had to go back and write down every publication I ever had, I don't know if I could even think of them. You know what I mean? So I just think all I'm saying is I'm not litigating the whatever. I just think we should just give them the heads up like we do on anything else, like we did on the fingerprint thing from the FBI or whatever the case.
We met last week. We met last week, and this was, of course, part of our conversation.
Okay.
I believe there's only one lab director. No, I think all the lab directors were present at that meeting.
So we shouldn't.
I wouldn't worry about
Okay.
that. I think all the lab directors are fully aware of what's going to happen.
All right.
I think the best thing, and this is my personal opinion, as the representative of NICLAC, we have different opinions on how to handle this. This is my personal opinion. I think each lab director needs to speak to each prosecutor's office to let them understand what they need to bring to the table now, and understand that something has to give. You can't do 70,000 drug cases if you're doing 35,000 before, and not providing a comprehensive discovery packet for every single one. So there has to be that balance. That dialogue is not going to be able to happen really, because we all have our own jurisdictions, our own unique way of doing business. I think every lab director is fully aware of this, I believe, and I think they've already had some of their meetings from their representatives. I received a letter from DASNY talking that they would like to talk to NICLAC. Again, my personal opinion is I think it needs to be done at a more local level, because there's such unique circumstances to each individual. Where, and I've met with our DA's office a number of times now just discussing this, plus our own legal representation. So I think,
I'm satisfied then if the labs are all fully aware of this and there's no issue.
I think as we're talking here, everyone needs to be fully aware that there's going to be consequences that are going to be detrimental, and I agree with Bill that this is not going to, January 1st deadline does seem unachievable with what we are interpreting, but that's why we're going through that interpretation process. What can be done by that point? What can't be done? And it won't be done because of choice. It will be done because it's not possible. It's physically not possible to run a laboratory and ramp up something in 6 months that is very comprehensive. Very comprehensive. So I think all the lab directors are going to abide by the law, but there's a part of the law that might not be able to be made because of physical restriction. There's not enough hours in the day, But again, I think that's it's on the agenda. If it is going to be on the agenda for the next meeting, we're going to be having these conversations over the summer, because we can't wait. I've already had I've got scheduled meetings every 3 weeks with my DA's offices, So,
and Jill did inform me that the Office of Forensic Services staff was ahead of all of us, and that they did email the statute out to all the labs before the meeting. So, all right, so we'll put this in again.
Could you include the commissioner in that list of distribution? I mean, I could go find it, but I haven't found it.
So again, I hope my positions don't come across as insensitive. The concerns are being raised. I'm concerned personally about the role of the commission. But I certainly hear, what lab directors and DAs are saying. It is going to go on additional burdens. We will put it on the agenda of our next meeting for any specific actions that people want us to take. And with that, is there any other new business? All right. We don't have any items in executive session. We do have our next meeting September 18th in Albany. And I do believe there's an ethics presentation that will be held right after this meeting for commissioners who need it. I'm not staying for that. Not because
have fun.
I'm not staying because I need a more extensive training than the one being offered. So I have to do my next Wednesday in Albany, and apparently it's an hour and a half instead of the hour that you're doing, or whatever the case is. So I have to do it. I just have to do a different one. But so with that, do we have a motion to adjourn? All right, do we have a second? All in favor?
Aye.
And again, I know I say it pretty much every meeting, but I appreciate the time and the effort and the viewpoints that every single member of the commission brings to the table here. I think collectively we do some very good work, and thank you to everybody for your input.
I'm not. I did already. Sorry.